Russell is... Yes, okay. Now the thing said it was recording. So I'm just going to cut that out when I add the video.
No
So I'll start
worries.
again. Okay. Hi. Today I'm talking with Russell Newquist, who's, let me see here, an independent author, well, not just starting, but in the process of or running a, would you describe it as an independent publishing company?
Yeah, that would be the best way to call it, I would say.
Okay. You published, what, 4 books now?
We've published, let me think, we've published 3 actual books, 1 role-playing supplement, and about a half dozen, a few more short stories electronically.
Cool. Okay, you're also, by day, you're a programmer. By night, you're a karateka, or karate instructor. I assume
Yep.
that's an acceptable term, too.
Sure.
And I think there's something else. Is there something else I'm forgetting that you also do in your copious spare time?
Just play dad. That's it.
So, okay. So you've got a project called Lionesse, which you're getting off the ground as part of. That is under the umbrella of Silver Empire, right?
Yes.
Okay. Which is bringing short stories into the modern age, which is a very interesting project, I think, and one, especially one to talk to you about. But so, sort of to put this in a context, how would you describe the history of short stories leading up to the current problem that you're trying to solve?
Well, back in the early days of science fiction as a genre, fantasy as well, so short stories were a large part of it. In the early 1900s, you had a lot of authors that made most of their living and most of their mark writing short stories in the pulp magazines primarily. But you have authors like Robert E. Howard. The Conan series, for instance, massively popular, still to this day has a huge influence on the entire genre. And it was pretty much all just short stories that he wrote for the magazines. And you used to be able to make a fairly decent living doing that. You could put out, short story every month in one of these magazines and make enough money that you wouldn't get rich doing it, because most authors honestly never really get rich, but you could live off of it and feed your family and, take care of it. And that kind of continued through the 40s and 50s. You had a lot of authors who used to do a lot of that as well. Heinlein did a fair amount of that back in the day, and some of the others. But one of the problems you run into now is the magazines that still exist. The rates for writing for those magazines is basically stuck. It hasn't changed since the 1960s.
Wow.
And as all of us basically know, inflation has changed a lot since the 1960s. It's typical rates, if you can get published in one of these magazines, are about 3 to 5 cents a word, which works out to, if you're lucky for a rather longish short story, $200. And in 1960 that was real money, but in 2016 that's that might buy you might pay half your car payment, maybe. That's about it. And on top of that, you run into the problem that most of these magazines don't even exist anymore. They're going out of business. The magazine market in general is dying. It's really been hit hard by the internet age.
They haven't been able to make the transition over to digital by and large?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, so most of them have not been able to make the transition over to digital?
Well, what they haven't been able to do is to make a transition to digital that still makes them money. A lot of them have made some sort of transition to digital, but the problem is that advertising is what paid the bills for all these magazines for forever and ever. And internet advertising has some great advantages and some great disadvantages. One of the advantages, if you've ever tried to use it yourself, is you can get really good information on how effective it actually is. So you get great answers. Hey, this ad met this many people. I got this much, this many people are clicking through, this many people actually saw it, lots of demographic information on who they are, how many of those people actually bought something from me. And if you're the person selling advertising, this is actually a huge disadvantage, because what you find out very quickly is that your advertising is not actually all that effective. So the rates that you can charge for it kind of drop through the floor.
Actually, I remember reading about an executive in the 70s, 80s, something in that range, who mentioned half of our advertising budget is completely wasted. I just wish I knew which half.
And the problem is today that's still true from our perspective. But anyway, getting back to it, what you end up with is there's a lot of wasted advertising money that now we know for sure it's wasted. We can absolutely say that doesn't work. And it's not just it's not just magazines. A lot of television is now having trouble. You can see, with online media, Netflix and Amazon Prime have become big competitors with the major broadcast networks. They've already been facing competition from the cable networks. They've been losing ad revenue for years as well. And on top of all that, you have the fact that the American consumer is just becoming immune to advertising. We're so bombarded with it everywhere we go now that we've just learned to tune it out. Like, I don't know about you, but I have a DVR at home, and I never watch live TV anymore. And
the only TV I watch is through Netflix.
Yeah, it's either Netflix, Amazon Prime, or DVR. And if I'm watching it on the DVR, I promise you I'm not watching commercials. So, we're tuning all these ads out. So when your entire business model relies on advertising dollars, and the advertising dollars are either going somewhere else or deciding, hey, you're just not effective for us, or whatever you have, or your subscription counts declined, so you don't have as many people you can, you can say, hey, your ads reach this many people. It hurts the bottom line really bad. And it's not just the science fiction and fantasy short story market. Magazines across the board are dying bad. Mm-hmm. Like the major news magazines that are the ones that were major that I remember as being major, it's hard to call them that anymore. But like Newsweek and Time and those magazines, they only survive now because basically rich people bought them and want them to continue. Otherwise, they'd be out of business already. That they're losing the money. And in my teenage days, that's where you got news from. If you wanted something serious, more in depth than a 30-minute nightly news section, that's where you got it. And now they're dead.
Yeah, well, returning, I think, as I understand it, to some degree to how newspapers started, because they were originally the playthings of the wealthy.
Right. A lot of it was, yeah.
Fund them to get the word out, but not really looking to make money off of them.
Right.
And then someone figured out how to make money off of them. But then I think Craigslist too really hurt the newspapers badly, as I understand it.
It's definitely had an impact, because the classified ads was a major source of revenue as well, and now it's not. You can't make money off of that because of Craigslist.
I'm curious, by the way, this is a slight sidetrack, but just about the psychology of reading ads, because as you mentioned, it's so good at tuning ads out. The only reason, I've got an ad blocker that I use on one web browser only because I really hate I don't care about the ads that don't intrude, because I don't notice them. I hate the ones that pop over and make you have to move them around.
Some of them are really bad and really obnoxious.
Yeah, I found ones where on my phone, since I don't have an ad blocker there, I found ones where I literally could not use the website. The ad was just so obnoxious about it that I just said, screw this, and went away. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious about trying to use advertisements, even if they're not so obtrusive. That there's still, I think, a little bit, because I can remember looking at a magazine and flipping pages, and there's a full page ad, and it take a second or two to look at it just because there's a pretty picture and words, and not when I'm reading a magazine or something like that, I'm not I don't have other things to be doing at the moment. I'm in more of a relaxed mood. Whereas doing stuff online tends to be, at least for me, I'm curious if you think this is common, a lot more of something you fit in between other things. So you have less, leisure is something you cram in, and so you don't want to waste precious seconds looking at anything else. And do you think that applies to the online setting?
I think it definitely can. Not everybody uses the web that way, but for a lot of us who are, squeezing in a few minutes here and there, maybe on a 5-minute break at work, or, as a fellow programmer, you probably know this, if I hit the thing that's taken 5 minutes to compile my software, what am I going to do for 5 minutes? So I'm pulling up some web page, looking at the news or whatever. So yeah, there's that factor. The other factor you get online that's really big is that the price of exit is basically zero. If I don't want to sit and look at your ad, it takes me half a second to pull up another web page. So if your ad can't keep my attention for that long, then I'm gone. I'm going to do something else. I don't want to wait 2 seconds. We live in an instant gratification world where we can get what I want to find so quickly that why would I wait through your ad to get it if I don't have to?
So, okay, so this, giving us a historical context to where short stories had been paid for primarily through advertising, and that's been dying.
Right.
So now, what's the model you're using to overcome this problem with Lionesse?
Well, we're not advertising driven at all. We're instead working off a subscription model. But what we are doing is, for us, this is kind of, there's a couple things we're doing. One part of it is that we're working to keep our costs as absolutely dirt cheap as we possibly can. There's a reason you don't see a lot of fancy artwork with what we're doing. There's a reason you don't see a lot of fancy web pages or everything. We're just trying to pare it down to the bare minimum, get a story out to the user. It keeps our costs really small. So on the first part is we don't actually have to generate a lot of money to begin with. And then what we do generate, we can try and pass that on straight on to the authors. We're not worried about a lot of that. For us as Silver Empire, kind of the goal of making, from a profit perspective of this is really, it's kind of the other way around. For us, we view this as advertising for us rather than charging somebody else to advertise for them. This is a case of, we don't have to make a lot of money because it's another way to get our name out to other people and build an audience that then hopefully some of those people want to come buy books from us later and work that direction. So it's
if I can, in part two, not just to get your name out, but also I assume that for a publisher, a lot of name recognition is your judgment, that you work with people who write good stories, so if they see it's published by Silver Empire, they know they're likely to enjoy it. So that's the sort of thing you mean?
That sort of thing, definitely, but also the factor of, you got to be honest, in the modern day and age, people mostly, readers, consumers, mostly don't actually follow publishers. There's a few exceptions to that, like Castalia House has built a really strong following based largely on the personality of its founder. But for the most part, people don't follow publishers. They follow authors, right? You have an author that you like and you read that author wherever he goes. So part of the purpose is for us to have a channel where we can get people, get works from our authors out in front of people and say, hey, here's the work, here's at least a sample of it, a short story. You can view it as kind of a sample. If you like the work, hey, look, we've got a whole catalog of other stuff from this author that you might be interested in. And to help authors who aren't normally through Silver Empire the same thing, then that's a lot of authors these days, largely, if they write short fiction at all, they view it that way. It's a way to get your work out there, to give somebody almost a sample of it, let them feel it, get a feel for it, and then, that's kind of the crack model. You give a little bit away for free or cheap, and then get them coming back wanting more. So that's kind of a little bit of the approach that we're taking with that. The other thing that we've done is, and this is where I think a lot of people have broken down, trying to get the magazine model into the digital age, is that people are still trying to charge subscription fees that would match, what you would pay for a magazine. these days, $4, $5, $10 a month, right? Well, for $10 a month, I can get an unlimited amount of video from Netflix. So why would I pay $10 a month to get maybe a half dozen short stories from your magazine? So our approach is to kind of go the other way of we've gone on a very, very low cost. We're looking at about $7 a year for our subscription fee. And our goal is to just scale it and grow enough of a user base that becomes enough revenue to pay our authors what we're trying to pay. And I have to throw out there, go ahead, you had a question.
Well, actually, yeah, I'll come back to that in a second, but I'm curious, there seems to me, I think, a trend I see, and I'm curious to see if you see it, is, and this is something Patreon does, although Patreon has some very specific elements to it. But one of the things I find very interesting about Patreon is the way that it enables, it's sort of the flip way, for like some popular YouTubers have this, where they have a Patreon, and so a few hundred people might chip in $1, $1 a month, $3, $4 a month, largely just because they really enjoy what the person does and want to fund it. And I think the name Patreon was actually fairly well chosen because it is very reminiscent of that model, in the Middle Ages, where someone would be the patron of an artist because, well, they do good art and you want to make it, and to some degree, even that art may be given away, at least, especially now. There's a great tie-in with the church in the Middle Ages, because one of the things you do as a patron would be to have an artist go and do works in a church, in which case that's then really being given to the public because everybody comes into the church, and so there's that idea of just, you have the money to do it and supporting artists because you like what they do and want it to be available. And it seems to me that there may also be that psychology, as we're getting into that, where it's becoming possible, even if you're not rich, to still fund things. There's one or two things that I do where I contribute to Patreon on, of all things, one of them's a guy who makes resources for Minecraft that makes Minecraft look really beautiful. My son uses it, and I do, and I really appreciate it. So I just want to help with that, and can afford to do so because it's just a small amount of money that way. I'm curious if you see something similar in this, where it becomes possible for people to essentially, because the thing about Patreon is it's sort of one-on-one. It doesn't make sense to be able to do 10 cents to an author each month. It just doesn't work that way. Right. But it seems to me Lionesse does give that option too to people, where you can sort of become a patron of a collection of authors, where you're not. So do you see that, just psychologically, I guess, maybe that's not the right word, but that is a way that somebody can be subscribed to this too, where, just helping to make good fiction become available?
We've definitely benefited from that. Our Kickstarter, in fact, that we have been successful so far in meeting our goal, but for anybody watching, there's still plenty of time to contribute to that. But it has definitely been successful on that front from several folks who I know who really just have contributed beyond the base subscription fee because they really want to see the project succeed. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from a lot of authors in particular, of course, who would love to be able to have a viable short fiction market again. There's lots of people out there who want to see the project succeed, and we've been very fortunate that some of them have contributed to help with that. And that's, our particular business model moving forward is not quite as amenable to that as it maybe could be. Which is actually something I might take from this and go ponder on and see what we can do to improve it. But absolutely getting started, we've benefited from that model. And that is definitely part of what we want to do. And part of the problem that the fiction market lacks by not having a viable short fiction subset of it anymore is, historically, that's kind of been the path that authors have followed to learn their trade. You start off with something like anything. If you want to learn it and get good at it, you don't start off by building the biggest possible thing you can build, right? You start off with something small and you kind of learn how to do it, learn what you're doing, and do that a few times until you kind of get it down, and then you graduate up to the next bigger process of it. And obviously there's no rule, there's no law that says you can't write short fiction anymore, but if there's nobody ready to pay you for it, most people aren't going to do it. And then whether there's no payment or not, if you can't get it published and get it out there in front of people, you don't really get good feedback of, is this, well, you can get your friends to tell you to some degree, is this good or not? But your friends can't tell you, is this commercially viable or not, right? The only way you can really get feedback on that is to get it out in front of people and see if they buy it or not. And if there's no market for it, you can't get any of that feedback until you go through the work of writing your first novel, which, you know, most people, their first novel takes, what, a year, 2 years, 3 years? You know, a lot of seasoned authors can write them faster than that, but first-time novelists, that tends to be about what it takes. And that's a heck of a lot of work to put out into something when you really have no idea if you can do this well enough to be commercially viable. So
yeah. For a lot of authors, there's also the element where you may not have hit on the best thing that the best thing for you personally as an author with your style and so on to be writing.
Right.
You know, and there's the model where you go and keep on rewriting it and so on. But I'm reminded there's a programming adage I've heard. You might have as well about, you know, plan to throw the first version away. You will anyway.
Right.
And I've having written a few novels that I've just published, self-published. I can definitely see that. Like the first few, I used NaNoWriMo as the way of getting a first draft, and the it was the, I think it was the fourth one that I did. No, I think it was the fifth one I did, that I finally really hit something that was in the form where I wasn't going to largely rewrite it in order to publish it. And since then, I learned a lot in those first few. And there's a lot to be said for it if you can possibly scrounge up the time. NaNoWriMo is not easy to do, right. But yeah, there's exactly that problem. There's no, you're kind of jumping in, and if you can, I sort of worked essentially as being my own patron, where I just did this on the side, while completely having a day job. So it does have that effect of where, as you say, there isn't, you're kind of jumping in and just subsidizing yourself for many years, and there isn't a way to build up at all. You're just kind of, you're there and you just figure out some way to make it work.
It's almost all or nothing. You're either ready to commit 1,000% or, I'm going to do something else. And, it certainly would be nice if there's another way to do it. And, we're making the effort to bring that back. Now, the flip side of that is that there's more that has happened in the short fiction market as well. And, we're giving this one everything we've got, but it's an uphill battle. One of the other things that's happened is that the market has somewhat changed for what people want out of their fiction. A lot of times people want long fiction a lot these days. And certainly the fantasy genre is a good one. What sells the best in that genre tends to be long fiction, and longer the better. People like long epic series that go on, there's 20 books and, all that. So, we still think there's a market out there for short fiction if we can reach it the right way. But we also have to admit straight up, and we put this on our Kickstarter page, that this may all be a quixotic adventure in figuring out that market's not really there after all. So, it's a bit of a just, the only way to really find out is to try something that's actually different than what people have been doing up to this point and see if it works or not.
It's interesting you mention that in the taste in fiction, because short fiction, a short story is, one way of looking at it that I've liked is that a short story is a different art form than a novel. It's not.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah, it has a different structure. you get very different things out of it, and it's constructed in a very different sort of way. Especially, thinking of the good short stories that I've seen, they're very different, very different than novels. Now, so I mean, but one of the curious things about all art forms as well is that an art form, there's skill not only in making an art form, but there's also skill in appreciating an art form. And I mean, that can get pushed. I mean, and it can also be abused. There's the people who will have piles of dung and tell you that the reason you're not appreciating this pile of dung on the floor is because you're just not smart enough for it. But I mean, that's an abuse of something that is very real, that there are a lot of art forms where you need some idea of the structure of it in order to be able to appreciate it. So I guess there's the interesting thing of, can you also, is there enough of an ability to appreciate short stories, and can you help people to develop that skill in appreciating short stories?
I think that's a great point to make, and I think you're absolutely right about the pile of dung. But I make the same point in other cases. I've made it to other people, and for instance, in music, enjoying pop music is easy, right? There's a reason everybody likes pop music. You don't have to know anything about music. You get a catchy tune, it gets in your head. It's great.
Uses the same chords as every other one, so you recognize them fairly
right. Well. Enjoying the symphony or opera takes a little bit of work, at least to a modern listener. You have to know a little bit. You have to engage your brain a little bit. It takes some effort to enjoy that at the same level, and it's often worthwhile if you put in the effort. But you have to put in the effort, and a lot of people aren't willing to do that right at the beginning. So hopefully we're not fighting that battle too much as well, but maybe we are. Who knows? We'll find out, like I said.
Well, it's also possible, it strikes me, because you've got such a lean business model, that you may not need that many people in order to make it viable, that when something that happens a lot is that people don't know what it is they want until it's there and they try it. And there's that idea of the customer's always right. And I heard Steve Jobs famously sort of turn that on his head. Most of the time, the customer has no idea what they want.
As another person in the software profession like he was, I can tell you absolutely the customers often don't know what they want. And in that business, a lot of the time it's because they don't know what's possible. So they might tell you something that they want, but then you get a bunch of people in the room who know, hey, we could do all these things instead. And you could give the customer something completely different than what they asked for, but it actually solves the problems they're really trying to solve.
Well, there's the trivial. I think there are multiple layers, because I've heard, I presume a lot of people have that trivial thing about, the customer says we want to be able to, a drill bit that can do this, but what the customer really wants is a hole. Well,
right.
I mean, and that's true, but there's another layer to it where often, if you have, say, glue, the customer doesn't even want a hole, because you're going to put a bolt and so on through. But if you had a good glue, you wouldn't even bother with that. And
right.
so you see that in software too, where if you can introduce a new capability that just makes this problem entirely go away, they don't even need that solution to it anymore.
Absolutely.
So now this is a little bit far afield of fiction, but at the same time, I think it relates in this sense that if there is, if there is a stream of short fiction available, it becomes possible for people to sort of dip their toe in it and find out they like it.
Right.
But, with that largely dried up or in very expensive magazines, or another thing I've noticed is that all human endeavors that are judged become weird. Like, you can see this in bodybuilding. I mean,
sure.
Bodybuilding, figure skating, what's it, the dog shows,
right.
where whatever it is, if you have judges judging something, the problem is over the years, the judges become kind of bored with what they've seen already, and so things have to become new. And you need this constant progression of change in order to keep the judges interested. And so all endeavors judged become weird, and editors judge when it comes to fiction and so on. I mean, I think there's a, not to get too far into it, but in the various debates that have come up about the nature of awards,
Right.
like the Hugo Awards, which a great many people I think find that the people judging these things have very strange tastes. But it's, I think, a perennial problem that all things that are judged face, is that if you see the same thing done well in the same way each year, you get bored with it. It's just sort of fallen human nature can't appreciate goodness that it's already appreciated. At least, not to the same degree. It takes a lot of energy to be able to appreciate the same good thing more than once. So there is that problem too. I'm guessing that in the currently existing magazines that still do exist that have some short stories, having that many decade tradition, they may well have developed somewhat strange tastes in what fiction they like to publish these days.
That's certainly possible. I hadn't really thought about it quite in those terms before. Thinking about it that way, I can definitely see your point that you're making there. And a lot of those magazines, the ones that are still around, have been around for a long time, and very easily could be suffering from exactly the problem you describe. There's certainly, not to get too much into the politics of some of the awards you've talked about there, because that could take us way off field as well, but there's certainly a particular kind of taste that has developed in those magazines that seems to have some kind of audience, but I think there's a large audience out there that's still being left out by that taste, that is not interested in those and is interested in other kinds of things. And that's part of our approach as well, is we're trying to stay a little bit more out of the political side of it, but we see underserved markets, and my perspective is an underserved market is an opportunity for a businessman, and so we want to try and see what we can do about that and get into it, and not just in terms of taste or politics or whatever, but in this particular case, we see short fiction seems to be an underserved market. People are telling us that. We're hearing feedback from that. We're getting a lot of people saying, "Hey, I want more of this, and I can't find it." But again, at the end of the day, the only thing to really do is to get out there and put a foot out there and try it. I think there's other folks who are doing that. Some of them doing what I think is great work. Sursova, the magazine out there, the Sci-Fi Journal. I think they're really doing a great thing by trying to do that. And I hope that I'm wrong when I say this, because I like the work that they're doing, but I also worry that they seem to be following the traditional magazine business model that I can't help but see as fundamentally doomed. Not because they're doing anything badly or putting out bad work, but just because that business model is basically not for the 21st century anymore.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, because talking about the underserved markets especially made me think of the other thing I think of with Silver Empire, when I read about what you're doing, which is what you call, I think you borrowed the term perhaps, but subversive fiction.
Yeah, I absolutely borrowed the term. Stole might be a better word, but yeah, it's not my word at all. But we did use it, and we absolutely saw that as an underserved market. There's a lot of.
Well, first, do you want to define it?
Well, there's multiple definitions. People define it differently, but just to give an off the cuff definition. Less of a definition and more of a description. When I was a child in the 80s, and a little bit before that, the 60s and 70s, basically kind of all art, movies, television, books, stories, comic books even, the prevailing wisdom was, man, we came out of the 1950s when everything was so Leave It to Beaver perfect. We've got to get flaws of humanity back in here. We've got to get these characters more interesting and deep, and they're not just perfect cardboard cutouts, and all of this, and they were right. Okay, I'm going to make the statement first that they were right. The 50s, the art that came out of that era was a little bit too whitewashed, to everything's perfect. But in the years since then, in the decades since then, there's been some stuff that's really just taken that way too far. And we have artwork coming out now. I know some people like to use the example of George R.R. Martin, and that's a loaded one because I still really love, especially the first few books in that series. But it has gone really bad with just like everybody who has an ounce of being a decent human being is dead at this point in the series, right? And it's not even that the characters left are flawed. It's like you have to hunt to find their redeeming factors anymore.
And I assume that the good ones aren't coming back with additional powers with the change of clothing?
Not from what I've seen yet. But the better, that's the one, that's a popular example. But one of the ones that I like to give is the show, and I've only ever watched a few episodes of this on purpose, the show Dexter, right?
I haven't seen it, but I know of it.
We've evolved to a society where our idea of good artwork now is to turn a serial killer, a literal serial killer, into a hero. Now, I've seen a few episodes of the show, only a few, and it is a good show, and I get it. But at the same time, there's something fundamentally wrong with us as a society, and as when we're trying to turn serial killers into heroes. And this has been taken even a little further in the last couple of years, because just in the last year or two now, there's a show on TV that I just heard about recently. I think the name of the show is Lucifer. And we have evolved. We have evolved into a world now, into a modern world where we have literally turned the devil into a hero. Now, okay, I'm not trying to preach religion at anybody here, but think about that for just a minute. Even if you're not religious, think about that. And
it's sold with a ha-ha, only serious sort of approach. You know,
it is.
Well, you know, he's the devil. Except we do actually kind of mean that, really, actually.
Right. That's the problem. Is if when you start to look at it, is they do actually kind of mean it. And even if you don't, even if you sell it with the ha-ha premise, when you go too far in that direction and you let yourself enjoy that thing a bit too much, it does actually take a bit of your humanity away.
Oh yeah. Well, plus there's something very often missed is the nature of temptation. And the nature of being able to resist temptation. And one of the problems when you make the devil your protagonist, even if the idea, I have no idea how on earth they do it. I mean,
I've never seen the show. It's probably really good. I don't know. But
well, I bet you it's all television. One thing I've noticed, television these days, people have really learned the art of making it addictive. There are tons of skilled cameramen and makeup artists and so on. So you get beautiful people shot and lit very, very well. And writers have really figured out the art of how to make a show literally addictive. Like my son would watched a little bit of Clone Wars, the animated series Clone Wars, and I'd occasionally walk by, and if I was walking by the room and caught it, I would kind of stand and stop, and I only had to see like about 20 seconds to really want to know how it ended. Except when it did, I really didn't care in the slightest anymore about anything that had happened, and would forget about it almost instantly. And I noticed this happening a bunch of times, and I started thinking about, like, why is it that I actually have trouble walking out of this room, but every time I've done this before, it's not that it was unsatisfying so much as it just didn't matter. It said nothing about the human condition. It had nothing particularly interesting to think about afterwards. There was nothing I remembered from it, really.
I was at Dragon Con in September, and I was sitting in a panel where John Ringo, the best-selling author, was one of the panelists up there. And he was talking about how, as a writer, it's basically, you think you're selling words, but what you're really selling people on is the chemical changes that happen in your body when you go through all of these emotional responses to everything. And basically what you're selling people is a drug reaction that your own body produces. He didn't quite use those words, but he was saying that very much. And he said it a lot better than I am. But, he was talking about, doing things in your writing to get people on the emotional highs and then bring them back down. And, all the various things that get the endorphins flowing in your brain and the emotional impact. And you're absolutely right that certain aspects of that, the modern world has become complete experts on, and can absolutely nail down. And modern movies, you can see it a lot in movies and television both, that, I hate to use this example because I always feel like it's the one the elitist movie snobs use, but and I've quite enjoyed some of his movies, but Michael Bay, I think, is kind of the exact master of that. Like you watch most of his movies and there's very little of any real substance in the movie at all, but it's a masterpiece of just taking you through those, shock waves to your body that, it's like a roller coaster ride, right? At the end of the day, you're really riding it for the rush, the adrenaline rush that you get out of it.
Well, and the hooks of how is this going to end? How are they going to solve this problem? Right. Presenting them and just, so you have just enough information so you're speculating. And of course, once you start speculating on how are they going to do it, then you really need to see, like, am I right? Are they going to do it the way I would have done it? That stuff it really does hook you.
And it hooks you in, and it gets you, you wanting to get it, and you find out what's happening next. And in a certain sense, all modern television has become soap operas. They've been the masters of it, doing that since forever. And now everything is on there. And I say that jokingly. My actual honest opinion is that modern television is better than it's ever been. There's still a lot of crap on TV, and that's never going to change. But
what's it, Sturgeon's Law?
But just some of the amazing stuff you see on TV these days, some of it is just leaps and bounds better than what was ever on. Again, as a child of the 80s,
although I will note, actually, out of sheer curiosity, I went and found, I got really interested for a while in television history, television movie history. And it kind of fascinated me, actually, that TV basically started in the 1950s. I mean, invented in the teens, if memory serves, sort of perfected in the 20s. Really there in the 30s.
Really mass media in the 50s, yeah.
Yeah, it was really the 50s that started actual, more than a few hundred people or maybe a few thousand people having televisions, to where hundreds of thousands of people had televisions. So television as an art form started in the 1950s. So when you see shows in the 1960s, the 1970s, this is like 10, 20 years into this art form existing at all, really.
And they're still kind of figuring it out. They're still kind of learning, what can we do, what can we not do.
Yeah, absolutely. They are. But so I went back and watched some early stuff like Gunsmoke, for example, which was still the longest running television show ever. The Simpsons beat it recently in terms of number of seasons, but in like 490 episodes, and Gunsmoke did, a season or two less now. In like 600.
Beat out Doctor Who?
Well, yeah, Doctor, especially in terms of number of episodes.
I know they got the big break in the middle with Doctor Who, but so some people get all pedantic about how they count that. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
If you do it by number of episodes, then yeah, totally beat Doctor Who. Because I mean, that's British. They only do an episode every 2 years or something. But joking aside, I went and watched some Gunsmoke, Wagon Train, some of those really early things, and actually they did some really good storytelling in those. Really skilled, really well done storytelling.
I would believe that, and some of those I should probably go back and watch some more of, which thankfully we live in an age where that's easier to do than it's ever been. And that's actually, in my mind, one of the greatest things about, say, Netflix or whatever, is the not all the new stuff, but the preservation of content that it's done. I mean, the stuff you can get that's been out, that you're not just at the mercy of whoever decides to program the rerun schedule.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting problem that's going to be facing creative artists going forward. As things are ever more accessible and so on, just to use an example to make it more vivid, like I got really into Hogan's Heroes. And for those who don't know, it's made in the 1970s. It's set in a prisoner of war camp in World War II, where it's a comedy series where the shtick is that they are, they've got like a series of underground tunnels and so on where they've got a base, and they're outfitting an embarkation point for other people who are escaping. So they never escape themselves. There's never been an escape from Stalag 13. Because they're there to help everybody else. So there are tons of escapees coming through, but none of them ever started there. So it's all about the incompetent Germans and things like that. Really, really funny show. There's some details where things that were kind of very new and fresh, like there is absolutely no way I will ever do this, and then you cut right to the person doing it, which was fresh in the 1970s, and is by now so overused. So there's a certain amount of having to be able to remember that this is new and not trite. But like I really enjoyed that to the point where I'd much rather watch Hogan's Heroes than many things, even decent things, shot now.
Sure.
And Hogan's Heroes isn't for everyone, but, and I think this is especially kind of something really coming to the fore as technology makes more and more things available. Hogan's Heroes isn't for everyone, but for each person, there's probably some show that was made between the years 1960 and 1980 that they do really like, just by personality and so on. So it'll be different for different people, but with all that stuff becoming available, there are issues of finding it, but new creative artists will be competing not just with other creative artists now, but also with decades worth of creative artists.
Sure.
And I mean, it's still the case, for a new novel, I'm kind of an unusual person, but still, for a new novel, I do have to weigh this against: would I enjoy this more than rereading Pride and Prejudice again? Because I happen to be a big rereader, and I really like Pride and Prejudice. But there's still that increasingly going to be that issue of you're competing with decades and decades, and especially the best of decades and decades. And as we get better at finding things, this is going to be something that I think everyone is going to have to be dealing with. That as tastes balkanize.
Definitely, and that's a specific case of, actually, if you look at it more generally, the biggest problem that faces content creators right now. Even 10 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago, the biggest problem you faced as a content creator was distribution. Getting it out there in a way that people could actually get at it was by far the biggest problem, because it was expensive. No matter what you did, it was expensive. Well, now distribution is cheap. It's dirt cheap, or certainly can be, depending on what you're trying to distribute. And the problem you face is actually discovery. How do you get your product in front of people and get them to even know that it exists when there's so many things out there? I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, and I don't have them right in front of me. But if you look at the reports for publishing, for some reason I thought this was a brilliant industry to get into, but there's something like 1,000 new books a day published on Amazon every day. Every day, 1,000 new books a day. And at the same time, if you look across the United States, there's something like 1,000 fiction authors who actually make a living off of their work. So when you look at those kinds of daunting numbers, the problem you run into is, how do you get your stuff noticed? How do you get somebody to pay attention to your work out of all of these millions of other products out there that are competing for their entertainment dollars? And it's a huge problem. It's a massive problem. I won't certainly claim to have all the answers to it. I think we're, throwing a few things at the wall to see what sticks, like everybody else is right now.
Actually, it brings up an interesting question, since we're both programmers. Have you thought about, within Lionesse, have you thought at all about, the sort of, Bayesian recommendation things where, as you find other people who like things, helping to navigate the, both, the new stuff that's available. And I assume a lot of people who sign up for this, especially at first, will be the sort of people who really like having, a constant stream of new things. But it strikes me, it's especially given the digital nature of distribution, there's at least an opportunity there for, as you can like things, and then other people who like them start making recommendations on the basis of the other people who liked this and hated that. Have you thought about? I mean, obviously,
we haven't yet. We've kind of gone the other way. One of our theories, so the magazine market's died, but the one place you still can get short fiction is Amazon, right? But the problem you run into in Amazon is exactly the one you described. And what we were just talking about a minute ago, there's millions of stories out there, and how do you pick the one that you want? And I also think there's also a bit of a price issue there, because based on Amazon's pricing scheme, you're pretty much locked into a 99-cent minimum for a short story, and for a lot of short stories, it's probably honestly too much. There are a lot of people to pay. And then you kind of get the flip side of problem of, if it's much cheaper than that, nobody wants to pay it, because how many you want to pay a quarter for something? You feel ridiculous. But anyway, getting sidetracked off of that. With Lyonesse, we kind of went the opposite way, and we thought, look, we're going to actually cut down the number of things that we have. So our plan is basically we're going to be shipping out a new story every week. So one a week. And that's a rate that basically people can keep up with. One short story a week, even a slowish reader can probably keep up with that if they choose to. There'll certainly be plenty of stories they probably choose not to read. But somebody who wants to read them all, even as a slowish reader, probably can. And so we're looking at that plus a few bonus stories every now and then. So we're looking at something in the nature of like 55 to 60 stories a year. And with a number that's that small, something like a Bayesian recommendation, it's certainly, until we have a few years worth of back catalog available, is probably not going to be particularly useful, because the quantity there is small enough. In 4 or 5 years, maybe, when we have enough there.
Are you going to give people the option of essentially thumbs up or thumbs down now, so you can start building the data?
Not right off the bat, but we will probably give that fairly soon. We're trying to keep it all pretty simple at the beginning, so we can get it up and going with minimal fuss and, like I said before, minimal cost.
You mean so it actually happens?
So exactly. That's one thing I've learned on numerous projects I've been on in the past is keep it simple and make sure it actually happens first. And if it exists, you can always build on it and make it better. But if it doesn't exist, it doesn't matter how awesome it was in your head. If it doesn't exist, it's worthless.
Yes.
The other comment that I'll make, though, back to your question is my own personal experience, and maybe this is just because I'm a weird guy, and I will admit that I'm a weird guy with weird taste, but my personal experience with such recommendation systems is that they're crap and they don't work.
That is true, although I have a sneaking suspicion they don't take into account things you dislike.
I don't know the answer to that. I know Netflix had a major contest a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, where they were basically offering a huge cash reward. They offered an anonymized version of a subset of their data of likes and dislikes for everybody, and star ratings. It's actual star ratings. And they offered a substantial cash reward to anybody who could come up with a better algorithm for making recommendations than what they were currently using. And the one that they paid it, I think they actually paid it out, if I recall correctly. And the one that they chose, the guy who won, his version really wasn't a whole lot better than what they already had. It was better, but not a lot better. And
yeah, I heard it was like 11% more accurate or something.
Yeah, something in that range. I don't remember the exact, again, I don't have it right in front of me, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but
very approximately. It was something like that.
Yeah, it was
better.
It was in that range. And the problem is that, in my opinion, based on being the consumer of those kinds of things, their accuracy is so bad right now that 11% improvement's just not really going to change everything. Like, I don't know if you remember, here's the counter example of that. Do you remember when Google was brand new?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, I remember like 1998-ish, when I first saw something from Google, and search was so bad. before Google.
Yes.
Like, we forget that now. A lot of people would just totally forget how bad it was. But, you know, Google came on the scene, and it was so much better than everything else that I switched instantly and never looked back.
Oh
Like,
yeah, it was actually
literally
kind
with,
of
like, I tried it for a week, and I never looked back after that. It was like, this is so much better.
you
And
get what you're looking for on page 1 sometimes.
right, and the the recommendation systems are as bad right now as search was back then. And Bayesian recommendation is what most of them are using, and it just doesn't work that well, in my opinion. It's now, in my case, some of that's complicated by the fact that you know, a couple years ago too, I started sitting down on my TV with the Netflix account and realizing that half my recommendations were based off of the likes and dislikes and viewing habits of a 3-year-old.
Pro tip for anyone with children coming: give them their own
separate account.
Netflix account before they watch the first thing, because otherwise,
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh wow.
We have that now. We have a separate kids account. I have a separate one for my wife, and mine is forever ruined.
I actually had to create myself a new one.
And I actually went through, like, 10 years ago, before I even got married. I went through, and I have, like, I've not created a new one, and it's totally just a personal thing, because I went through and rated like 1,500 movies and TV shows individually, because I was like, I'm going to help this thing. I'm going to help it. Give me good recommendations. And all of that work is totally wasted now. But you know, long story short, if you get more than one person involved, it totally destroys any algorithms we have now. They just don't work at all. But even without that, though, getting a little more serious for a minute, even without that, they just don't work for me. And sometimes, too, I get recommendations that come out of them that don't even make any sense. Like, I look at some of the recommendations that come out, and I'm like, just scratching my head, like, why do you think I'd like that? I have zero interest in that at all, like negative interest in that. Like, I'd really rather not even know about it. And it's showing up in my queue, and like, the stuff just, I don't know. And part of it is because I'm a weird guy. Like I said, my taste is all over the place. But I'm not actually sure that's as weird as I sometimes think it is. Like, I think most people's taste is kind of weird and all over the place. And
yeah, well, there are a few people who are diehard genre fans, and
right.
for them, I think things work because I mean, not particularly better than just browsing the genre.
Right.
But that being said, but yeah, in my experiences, you know, getting not too far away from 4 decades walking the planet, I've yet to meet a normal person.
Right.
You know, get to actually know somebody. I've still, you know, for anybody I've gotten to know, and there's a little bit of self-selection bias, I will admit, because you know, the people I tend to get to know are, you know, people who get along with me, and you know, you wouldn't expect normal people to get along with weird people entirely. But that being said, even somewhat casually, everybody always has weird characteristics to them if you know, spend more than 10 minutes talking to them.
They do. And they have weird taste. And I've seen shows that I do get shows from here now. Like, I hear somebody and I'm like, really? You watch that show? Okay. I wouldn't have called that. And, you know, and then the flip side of things, like, I have a lot of friends who hit me all the time. They're like, you don't watch that show? And I'm like, I'm just not interested in it at all. Like, not even a little bit. You know,
I'll throw. Funny. Oh, sorry.
I'll throw just one of my own personal quirks out there. I'm a huge Batman fan, right? I love the character. I'm a huge fan, and I have yet to see a single episode of Gotham, and I refuse to watch it. And it's a personal quirk of mine, and it's just because I'm offended. I'm personally offended that they made a Batman show without Batman in it. I won't watch it, and I hear it's good, and it probably is, and I'm just not interested in it at all. Especially after seeing Arrow and what they did with Arrow, and seeing they could have made a freaking amazing Batman show, and they chose not to. So anyway, I'll let you take it from there. You were going to ask something.
Well, actually, just an observation. I think it sort of accentuates your point. A lot of personal recommendations, you know, person-to-person recommendations, are often wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes they're great. I mean, there's definitely been stuff where someone told me, you really need to read this, and they were right. But there are tons of times when they're quite wrong. I get
There
5 pages
and
in, I'm like, I hope you never ask if I really like that, because I don't want to say no.
and I think we all have filters based on individual friends of ours that I have one family member I won't name because it is a family member that basically whenever she makes recommendations, I basically jot that down in the category of not going to watch that. And I actually have to say this is hilarious for the people out there, for anybody who knows the show, for not just years but literally for decades, my wife refused to watch Babylon 5 because this person had recommended it. And then finally she sat down and watched it, and she's like, man, I really should have watched that a long time ago. But in fairness to her, in absolute fairness to her, that is usually an extremely good filter. So I'm sure we all have friends like that. But even the friends who usually make good recommendations to us, usually very good recommendations, every now and then they lead us astray, and we're like, just okay, what were you on when you enjoyed that show?
Yeah, well, there's an interesting topic which I won't get into because it's too far afield. But one thing that goes into something I realized was, because I love Scooby-Doo, not any of the new stuff. I love the original Scooby-Doo, and I've got the DVDs of it, and I watch it with my kids, and I still love it. This isn't nostalgia. This is, I enjoy watching Scooby-Doo with my kids, and the thing I sort of realized is that now there are a bunch of other things. I used to enjoy He-Man. I caught 5-6 years ago. I caught an episode of He-Man and thought, wow, this is awful. I remember actually liking an episode of, as a kid, like 8, 10, somewhere in that range, the old Spider-Man, the really old Spider-Man, the one that had a great theme song. And then I saw
the one where Stan Lee did all the voiceovers.
I'm not sure. My memory doesn't stretch back that well.
Okay.
And I saw it. It's the one. It's the one where there's an episode where there were giant bees that were stinging people and turning them into giant bees, if I recall correctly. It's also the one where they had one episode that was like a recoloring of another episode with like different voices or something. It was, yeah, I hadn't realized how cheap it was. It's also the one where every time Spider-Man would swing, he'd go, I might be getting the direction wrong, but it was like that.
Yeah.
Like he'd swing from one side to the other, then back, which was, of course, mirrored. And then like at the camera, and no matter where he was going, no matter what, they used that exact animation. That's how cheap it was.
And they probably did it once at the beginning of the series and reused it throughout the entire rest of it, I'm sure.
They did, yes. Anyway, that one, I watched a few episodes with it 10 years ago, and a friend had it, and we went over. My wife and I went over to this friend's apartment, and she had it on. She was into bad movies, and not in like the sensible way of laughing at them, but I another very weird person. That series was so bad, I couldn't even summon the strength of will to get up and walk out of the room. I mean, it was so awful, so crushingly terrible. I just sort of sat there in this odd disbelief that anything could be done this badly. And another thing too, they had Spider-Man voice, something like this. It is I'm not doing it very well, but it was like the 1950s, dad sort of character for teenage. It was so astonishingly bad. So I don't have rose-colored glasses about everything. I'm quite willing to admit some stuff is just junk, and 10-year-old me didn't know any better. Scooby-Doo I really liked, and I kind of realized that we all have fiction that was formative for us.
Yep.
That we, and it's not just that we imprinted on it, but it gave us a particular insight into the world. The things we enjoy are all some way, waxing slightly philosophical, they're all, they're all a way of perceiving goodness. Because, happiness is all derived from, some avenue of seeing the goodness of God. And so, and we each have our own perspective. We each have some aspect of the goodness of God we're each given to see, and to some degree this forms our personality. And we share them, and we can share this with each other. And formative fiction essentially something that opens your eyes and allows you to see some aspect of goodness. Some, whether it's the goodness of quick motion, or the goodness of strength, the goodness of collaboration, or quick wits, or of witty dialogue, all sorts of things. Those are very generally, tends to be more specific, but that's what formative fiction does to us. It shows us something that was particularly good about the world. In Scooby-Doo's case, I love the collaboration in it. And I've noticed that about things. Like, I really enjoy where characters actually collaborate with each other, where they work together, where they really are genuinely a team, where they care about each other and working to help each other accomplish mutual goals. And I think there was an element in which I liked that, and then this reinforced it, and I saw it better. And so I think one thing that plays into these things is that you will have these things that formed us and gave us particular things that we really enjoy. You'll occasionally see that in something that so like there might be some TV show that would not normally be my thing, but it happened to have that particular aspect. Like, there was a team where the people actually were working together and actually tried to get along with each other.
Sure.
And I will just really enjoy that show because I really loved the group dynamic, even though, just making something up, it's about a group of sparkly vampires who try to train, unicorns, which would never be my thing. But for some reason, that team dynamic just really spoke to me, and I really enjoyed it. And then, I'd have a friend who happened to, and so that would make me appreciate every other aspect of the show much better than I ever would, because, I have an affection for it, for the thing I like.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll know a friend who, well, you really enjoy whenever people are throwing projectiles, and, they sometimes like throw nets onto the unicorns. Maybe you should check the show out. And then they'll come back and be like, what on earth were you smoking?
Well, it's funny. Yeah, it's funny you give that example. Two things two actual comments on that. The first one is to jump back in the conversation a little bit when we were talking about superversive and the definition of it. And one of the things, kind of the shorthand definition, the best shorthand definition that I like to give is actually kind of cribbed from John C. Wright. And the, going back to what I was talking about everything just going dark and warts, putting the warts in, everybody wants warts and all. And, the comment he made in one of his blog posts is, great, we have all the warts in, but we've forgotten and we've left out the beauty, right? And, the real world has warts. It does. It absolutely does. But it also has beauty in it, too. And, your comment there about wanting to see people cooperate and everything. And that is missing in a lot of modern TV. The second reason, that particular example is kind of amusing to me. I'm sure you've seen The Mummy, the recent one, Brendan Fraser and everything. And then The Mummy Returns, the sequel to it. The second one was a lot less loved than the first one. The first one's fairly popular. A lot of people really like it. The second one's have a lot of detractors. My wife and I really, really like the second one, even though a lot of people don't. And one of the things that really sticks with us is that it actually has a married couple in it that is not bickering and fighting with each other throughout the whole movie. Like, they're actually working together as a married couple, trying to work through the problems that are thrown at them as part of the movie. And, that really resonates with us in the modern world, where a lot of that is just completely left out. And, it's something that we both really quite enjoy, that they actually, try to make it work. So yeah, I totally can see where you're coming from. Scooby-Doo itself, I haven't actually seen it since I was a kid. So I remember loving it as a kid, but I loved anything animated when I was a kid. So I have had the similar experience that you talk about with Spider-Man, though. And that's one of my comments about TV being better than it's ever been. In the early 2000s, mid 2000s, when I got cable for the first time in my life. This was before even Netflix or anything, but I just got introduced to TV Land, the show, the channel that shows old TV, and realized just how bad some of my childhood favorite shows actually were. Like, I sure loved Knight Rider when I was like 8, and I realize now it was all the car, because that show had nothing else going for it. It's terrible. It is absolutely terrible in every way, except for having the coolest car ever built by man.
Yes, but there's those scenes. Turbo boost.
It is, and I loved it when I was 8. It was so amazing. And my parents had to have been humoring me, because I can't imagine that they ever liked that show for a minute on its own merits, other than watching me think it was awesome. And a couple other shows. Airwolf is basically the same thing. It's a horrendously bad show, except it had awesome theme music and the coolest helicopter ever, right?
Yes, well, and that great episode where he's playing the. I actually found that song, Poliushka Poli. There's a scene where there's an episode in the first season where he sneaks a Russian out of Russia. I think that's the one where they stripped Airwolf down so it had no armaments.
I remember that one, yeah.
Yeah, and at the end, and she's homesick, and he plays this cello, because it also had him playing cello on that lake in the mountains, which is just gorgeous. And he plays Poliushka Poli. So dun, 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 dun. Pardon the fact that I can't sing very well. And I remember that echoing over the mountains, over this lake, as like the greatest moment in all of Airwolf, despite the fact that it was the most awesome helicopter ever, and I loved every single time the chain guns would come out.
That's right, it was. And a couple other shows, like I loved MacGyver as a kid, and I still love the concept of MacGyver, and rewatching it, I realized it was kind of okay, and that was it. Now, the one I will say, the one that does hold up really well, the A-Team is every bit as awesome as I remember it, except for one thing, which is the fact that every single episode is exactly the same script. So you can't watch more than about 2 in a row. Don't binge that on Netflix. You will not enjoy it. But, watch an episode here or there, and it's still just as awesome as you remember. Maybe as awesomely bad as you remember, but it's just as awesome.
No, I remember my mom didn't want me watching that show, and I loved it. So I didn't get to watch as much as I could, but I just loved when they finally, because it was like Home Alone in reverse.
Yeah, I can see that.
Grown-up Home Alone reverse. They'd have to stake out essentially some fort and then defend it against the people who are going to come attack them using all improvised tools.
Using all the improvised tools. It was the same plot every time. It was always the same. What crazy contraption can they build this time? How are we going to get BA on a plane?
For those who haven't seen it, BA was deathly afraid of flying, and in every episode they had to put him on a plane. So, and every episode he would claim they're not going to manage it this time, and
they'd always do it pretty much in the same ways most of the time, usually by drugging him or some other outlandish thing. But anyway, a lot of TV from that era, a lot of things I went back to rewatch, and they really are just bad. Like they're not very good at all, and you look at them through rose-tinted glasses. So when you find the gems that were actually really good, you remember them and are like, wow, that's great. I'm glad I found it.
Yeah, no, I will say about Scooby-Doo, the animation quality is very low. And especially, that's one thing in animation that's really gotten much better is the simple visual quality of animation, especially with computers. I've got a friend who's super into anime, and the fact that computers can do the in-between things, so you only have to draw you only draw periodically, so you can put more quality into those, and the computer does the rest.
Right.
But having said that, and I don't mind the lack of visual quality or the occasional scene where you can see the one piece that's going to move because it stands out, being drawn differently in the background. I don't mind that stuff. And it is simple, I will say. But I nonetheless, I do recommend giving Scooby-Doo a try if you loved it and you don't mind tolerating low quality visual animation, because it was imaginative, but they just didn't have a big budget for it. Right. So like because I draw that distinction, like early computer games. I'm assuming you were into computer games like back in the days.
Yeah.
You ever played the King's Quest series?
A little bit, yeah. I wasn't as much into that at the time, but okay. I had friends who were.
Okay, well, one thing about it is, I remember in particular King's Quest IV, The Perils of Rosella, which, so we're talking, and I think this is common to other Sierra games are the ones I happen to know. But you're talking 320 by 240, 256 color palette. 320
the
by
graphics were
240
terrible.
pixels. And that was the good stuff.
That was great back then. I mean, we loved it. We thought that was amazing.
Well, and the thing is, like I went back and looked at some of them, and I mean, obviously, each, like a vinyl be made up of 10 pixels and kind of blocky, but at the same time, in the good stuff from then, I think what captured our imaginations was they were really good at being suggestive with the very limited, the limited tools they had. They'd have the house and they draw, something with the shutter kind of hanging off, and they put vines in just the right place, and they're good at putting things in places that suggested a scene that you could imagine.
They were also, there's an art form that's kind of lost now because it's not necessary anymore. But you look at some of those old games and they were amazing at making every pixel count. It was sort of just what they would use for it. I mean, it just, I've pulled some of those, not King's Quest, but I've pulled some others back out in recent years and just been blown away by what they were able to do with the limited tools that they had. But anyway, go ahead and continue your story. Sorry.
Oh no, actually, there's a really fascinating. I'll have to find it sometime and see if I can link it. There's a really interesting talk on the nature of 8-bit graphics and how, to some degree, art is defined by its limits.
Yeah.
And and so 8-bit graphics are to some degree enjoying a resurgence because the nature of how they suggest things, and all art is, especially visual art, is all suggestion. Mm-hmm. It's all cramming more reality into one picture that can actually exist there because it suggests the reality but can't actually show it to you, because if it showed it to you, then that would just be ordinary life. So I guess actually pulling this back to short stories, because I do have a tendency to digress. That's always struck me as an interesting thing about the nature of short stories as an art form, is they have, very distinct from novels, is they have very much that element of suggestion. That a glimpse where you can't see everything, and they really suggest what's sort of behind the curtain they've erected.
A lot of that, and a lot of the comment I made earlier too. Every word has to count in a short story. When you're putting out a story that's, or you're putting together a novel that's 100,000 words or whatever, you've got a lot of freedom. I just finished my first draft of my own first novel at about 107,000 words for the first draft. And when you're trying to put together something that long, you almost come into a territory of just having to put in filler, to fill it out sometimes, which, comes in later as the point where you got to cut that crap out and lean it up some. But on a short story, you're really in the other end of the boat. Like, you're trying to tell a story in, maybe 3,000 or 5,000 words, depending. And I've even seen a few try and get them under 1,000 words, the flash fiction. And it really comes down to every word has to count in order to make it get across everything you're trying to do, because you don't have the room for extra in there the same way with the pixels. And like you said, you have to suggest a lot more rather than showing or telling everything, because you just don't have the space, the word count to do it. It is a very different art form, and it's a different skill set as well than writing. It's an overlapping skill set, but it's not entirely the same. Slightly humorous comment on that as well. Again, another panel I was at DragonCon, Jim Butcher, who's always hilarious if you see him in person. He's a very funny guy. But somebody asked him, if he was doing more short stories, and the way he just went, like, physically, like he was just like, oh no, I don't want to do more short stories. This is painful. And he's like, I do as few of them as I can possibly do, because it is a different skill set. He writes, I love the Dresden Files. It's a wonderful series of books, which is why, I kind of stole one of his characters and reworked it to make it my own for my own series. Anyway, but as great as he is at that, the short stories are just a different thing. And, he very clearly recognized that and was responding to that. He's written some that are very good, but he hasn't written a lot. And I think, that explains why.
Well, yeah, there's another phenomenon too, and it related very much to the every word counts. There's a famous quote by Blaise Pascal, about something or other. Had I had more time, I'd have written you a shorter letter. And he signed off on some letter to somebody. But it really, really applies. You need a lot of time to make something short.
It can take a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah, and on the flip side too, there's also just a difference of tone. Like a novel that has a short story pace would just be exhausting. I mean, as a reader, it would be, be like that. What was it? That 4-hour highway scene in The Matrix 2. You saw that one, The Matrix Reloaded, or no? But
I have seen the second one. It's the last one I saw, and I
yeah,
do remember the 4-hour
like
highway scene, and I remember the movie being so bad I refused to see the third one. So
yeah, it was. Well, the third one turned out to be a tremendous. I saw all three. The third one was a tremendous disappointment. And the way that the second one ended, it was really the second one. It's really two parts of a movie, but there's that scene, the highway scene, where they actually built their own mile of highway, it turned out.
Right.
Because they were going to film for so incredibly long. It would cost so much money to shut down an actual highway for this sort of stuff, that it was cheaper to go in the middle of the desert and just build their own mile of highway, just make it curved so you can't see that doesn't go very far, and shoot on that, and they, over and over and over again. The scene itself, I joke it's 2 hours. It was actually, I think, 8 minutes long, 10 minutes long, something like that. Pure action sequence.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I watched the director's commentary where they said, we wanted the audience to be exhausted by the end. And I mean, they achieved that, but it was a terrible goal to have because everyone hated it. I mean, by the time the scene is over, you're just like, I'm not sure I'm sticking around for this thing. I mean, you're just so tired of it. Like, I can't deal with more movie right now. Just shut up, go away.
My wife and I have actually coined a term for it from another middle movie that had a similar phenomenon. The second, I don't remember the title of it, but the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the scene when they're sword fighting on the water wheel. And it also feels like it goes on interminably, and you're sitting there watching a completely ridiculous scene that goes on forever and ever and ever. And by the end of it, it's totally pulled you out of the movie completely. And so our term for this now is water wheeling. It's the water wheel scene. It's and the Matrix film is a wonderful example of it too, because now in the Matrix you can get away with it a little bit because of the setting that they're in, but even in the Matrix it's kind of a ridiculous fight, right? Outside the Matrix it's an absolutely absurd fight, but even in the Matrix it's kind of a little bit ridiculous even in that setting. And it's not just the length of it, which is interminable. It's just like, oh my God, are we done yet? Wake me up when it's done here. But it's also just so, you take the intensity level so high that it's just ridiculous now. It just doesn't do anything for you anymore. It's just like, okay, I'm completely out of the mood now. I've lost my suspension of disbelief entirely.
Yeah. So a novel, bring that back to novels, like a novel couldn't do short story for 200 pages.
No.
You're just exhausted a quarter of the way through.
And another good analogy I've heard there is to think of it for a novel, you kind of need to pace it. I've heard the term roller coaster used, but that's not the best immediate mental image. But you kind of got to bring your reader up, get them some excitement, then you gotta bring them back down and let them relax for a minute, and then bring them up again and then back down. You gotta, you want to bring each high a little higher than the last one until you get to the climax, but you gotta bring them down in between, or else you can't sustain the pace. Like you said, it's just too much, and it's too exhausting, or it's just dull. At a certain point, it's just numbing. It's okay, more of this.
Yeah, well, actually, it's funny because those moments, the relaxing moments, are often my favorite parts of novels, because often you get some of the best character development there.
You do. Well, and A lot of it's like real life. Like if you've ever been on if you've done anything in your life that's kind of exciting, which most of us have done something that's kind of exciting, it tends to be the down moments afterwards when that you really appreciate everything. You know, more examples of this. We did this kind of thing in the Boy Scouts, but my wife likes to talk about this one, and it was real too. When we went whitewater rafting together, and with a bunch of our friends, we went whitewater rafting out there, and we made the terrible decision of going whitewater rafting in April, I think. It was April, and the water was in the 50s. I mean, the temperature-wise, so it was cold. Like,
did you spring for the wetsuits?
What's that? No, we didn't do wetsuits either. It was in Georgia. You don't need wetsuits to go whitewater rafting in Georgia. Come on, who would have thought? No, it was cold, and that doesn't sound that cold to anybody who's not been in the water when it's that cold. But water that's that cold is cold, and whenever
well, to put that in perspective, if you'll forgive,
sure,
if you can hold on to that thread, just one of my favorite nature facts is that walruses are pink when they're in the air, because the water is so good at stealing heat, and they are built for that when they get up out of the water at 5-10 degrees, something in that range, when they get up out of the water and get on the land and hit the like -20, -30 degree air, they get overheated and they get so flushed they're trying to dissipate heat, and that's why they turn pink.
Yeah, it's the water. It's the thermodynamics, if anybody cares. I'm not going to go into that, but the water, when the water's colder, you feel it much more. So, we're in water that's in 50 degrees, mid 50s. It's cold. And, it was sunny. It was a sunny day, and it was fairly warm outside. So as long as we were rowing, and we were decently warm, we were okay. But when we stopped at all, we were just like, like turning into icicles. And then, we're getting the moments when we go crashing down into the waves, and my friend Steve is sitting in the front, and the water comes rushing up over him right into their lap, and he's sitting there shouting, "My balls are freezing," at all of us. But anyway, we get done with this. We spend the day whitewater rafting, and we're so exhausted. And on our way home, we stopped at this Italian restaurant that is like, I couldn't even call it a hole in the wall because there wasn't a wall, right? We were in the middle of nowhere, small town, and there's this Italian restaurant that's basically like cheap spaghetti. It's like any other day we would have considered this an absolutely horrible meal, right? Not horrible, it was totally edible, but I paid for this. And it's one of the greatest meals we've ever had, right? Because we're freezing, we're tired, we're bone weary, exhausted, and we're just sitting there, and it's hot, right? Which is about the only thing we cared about at that point. It's hot, and we're all just sitting there with our friends eating this, really not that great meal, and just loving every minute of it. And it's what happens, when you're in there, and you get it's the character. It's the shawarma scene at the end of the Avengers, it's there, and it resonates because if you've ever been in any situation remotely like that, how true that moment is in that scene. It is so real.
Yeah, that moment where you can finally relax because you're actually going to survive.
Right, and it's done, and you're like, okay, food. But you're so tired you can barely eat the food. So yeah, you get a lot of character development in those moments, and you get a lot. That's when you can really, feel the humanity of a lot of the characters as well, and get into it. And they can definitely be some of the most fun parts.
Yeah, I happen to like murder mysteries, and in general, I think the best scenes in a murder mystery is after the denouement, after it's been revealed, the killer's been apprehended, or what have you, depending on the story. And then there's the aftermath, and it's usually too short, in my opinion.
Right.
But that's always my favorite part of almost every murder mystery is that part, because you have all of that, and then people can relax, and that's the moments in which people are most often themselves.
Yeah, that's a good way of phrasing it. Is It is a lot when you're most often yourself, because we all put on masks when we deal with the world, and we kind of have to. It's how human beings are wired. But you get to the end of a moment like that, and you're too exhausted to put on the mask. So that's when the real you kind of shows through, in real life as well as in fiction.
Yeah, well, and there are other elements, related. Because mask is a very good term, but also a slightly charged term.
Sure.
You know, anyone who's ever been injured, where like a family member now needs to drive you to the emergency room, like you act very differently in this circumstance. Like I remember a time when my wife had a pet iguana, and it jumped up and bit my nose, and had for a good 3/4 of an inch, my nose was now in two pieces. And, I was bleeding quite profusely, and I remember she was in the bathroom, and in something like that, yelling and screaming will do no one any good, and could make things a whole heck of a lot worse.
Hmm.
So instead, of very calmly, like, will you be able to come out soon? Because I could actually really use your help in getting over to the emergency room. In that sort of calm tone, and it's a common sort of reaction, like where it's okay. You see this. I mean, you'll see this in movies about okay, the classic line, the Persians from 300, the Spartans, about the Persian arrows will be so thick that they'll blot out the sun, and then one of the Spartans says, "Oh, good, then we'll be able to fight in the shade."
Right.
And in one sense, it's very sincere, and in another sense, it's very much put on. But it's put on in a very sincere sort of way, and it does.
Right.
It epitomizes, I think, something where when the moment calls on us to be able to do something, and anyone who's a parent does this all the time, because your children need certain things from you. So whatever the heck your reaction to the circumstance is, you just have to be what your child needs. You're the calm one now, even though you're really worried, or whatever it is, because this is necessary. And your being calm is sincere. You do know that, like, you need to not panic. So I will show you being calm, because it is true that you should not panic right now. This has no, this is not what I'm thinking, this is not what I'm feeling. It's true, but it's none of those things. And only after everything's over and everyone's safe can any of that stuff actually come out.
Sure. Or a slightly different example, but the same concept at all. My 3-year-old son, the boy is destined to be the class clown. He will do anything to make you laugh, right? So we run into this problem. If you laugh at him, he will absolutely do again whatever he just did before. So we have, my wife and I quite often find ourselves having to go, don't laugh, because we don't want him to do again whatever he just did. Whatever he just did is terrible, and we don't want him to do it, but it's also absolutely hilarious. It's hilarious because it's terrible, usually. But we have to stop ourselves, and it's often very difficult to do in front of him. So sometimes it's clearly the laughing over here where you can't see me, which will not work for much longer, because he's getting old enough to kind of figure out that we're laughing anyway. But
I not as often, but yeah, I've seen that too. That I'm not going to let you know that was great, because you should not do that again. Yeah, I've also found that the same thing works against you. Siblings don't do that. You don't have that filter, and so my oldest son, because I've got 3, so to the middle one, especially the middle one would absolutely love it when the older one would be screaming in his face, shouting nonsense, this far away, shouting it, and we'd be telling him, stop it. Like, I know your brother loves it. Stop it anyway.
Nobody else will ever. Don't pour this habit.
Well, we can't stand it. The grown-ups in this room cannot stand this behavior. I mean, I know you're accomplishing your goal of making your brother happy, and believe me, Good job wanting to make your brother happy. That's wonderful. Keep doing that. But find some other method. I know this works wonderfully. And that's the problem, is there's very direct, immediate, positive reinforcement coming from, his 6-month-old brother who's just loving this is the best thing ever. And what do you say as a parent that competes with a baby smiling at you?
Not much.
Yeah, no, I think he imprinted on him. He still occasionally just shouts for no reason. But so yeah, so I bring this back, in those moments. Well, bring it back to the moments in the novels. So in defense of the slower moving novels, at least when you don't get so big that you can cram. I'm told War and Peace has like something like 100 pages on the history of the city of Paris just in the middle of it. Because once you're already over 1,000 pages, who'll notice? Just a mere 100 pages on this.
I know. I don't know that one because I haven't read it. I should, but I know Atlas Shrugged has literally a 50-page monologue.
Wow, I only got 150 pages into Atlas Shrugged.
I will admit, I didn't read the whole monologue when I read the book because it's kind of repetitive at 50 pages. Yeah, it's literally unbroken 50 pages, one character speaking.
Wow. Anyway. that book, I only got 150 pages. I gotta say, it's got one of the most amazing sex scenes I've ever seen. Including the fact that the sun had to be rising for something like 2 hours, because like the sun was rising and you're like walking off, taking a long walk, and the sun's still rising, and like the rising sun's going through the trees, and like I think at the end of the scene the sun is still rising too. The entire scene was amazing. That entire book was kind of, for a while on Twitter I was doing this project where I was reading it, I'd then like post little paragraphs of the most ridiculous portions I would find, and eventually I stopped. Actually, what was really bizarre, because I read half of Twilight.
I'm sorry.
Not on my own. It was with a friend. We took turns reading it to each other because that's the way we could get through it. And I will say, actually, in defense of Twilight, a very, very qualified defense, it does have a very unusual premise. Because its basic premise is, what if you fell madly in love with somebody who desperately wanted to kill you? That's not common as a premise.
Right.
I think you got to give me that. It's it's unusual as a premise. Few books have that as their premise. But having said that, what was really weird, I wanted to go back and compare Atlas Shrugged to Twilight. And I was going through, and what was really bizarre about it was Twilight didn't seem nearly so bad anymore. Like, as I'm reading Atlas Shrugged, and I got through some, it's only a few, like 20, 30 pages in, and I wanted to find a comparable scene. And I'm reading through, like, what was I complaining about? This is just kind of middling.
I have not read Twilight. I have sat through the movie. At somebody else's request, I'll just say that. But the comment I will make on it, everybody loves to joke on Twilight, and clearly I do as well. I'm not going to take that away from anybody. But my personal thing on Twilight is, if you look at it for what it actually is, rather than what it's labeled as, it's actually a really good example of what it actually is. Because the problem is we all, as science fiction and fantasy fans, right, and in this particular case as science fiction and fantasy authors, right, we all love to look at it and say it's a terrible horror fantasy book, right, story. And if you judge it on those terms, it is. But what it actually is not really a classic sci-fi or fantasy story at all. It's a paranormal romance, is what it is. Somebody put it in the science fiction section. Some marketer put it in there because they thought, if we can remove the stigma of calling this a romance novel, we can sell more copies. And you know what? They did. They did it very well. But if you look at it as a romance novel, it is down to a T. It follows the romance novel archetype perfectly, down to perfection, and it nails it. And that's why it's so popular. Because I hate to tell you this, as a sci-fi and fantasy fan or author or whatever, the romance novels outsell us by a lot.
Well, yes. Yes. Although, fun fact about, I actually read one romance novel in my life. And by odd string of coincidences, I actually started with a romance short story in a magazine that someone had, and somehow or other I was entertaining a room full of people by doing a dramatic reading of this, short story, and it's super stereotypical. I mean, there was nothing redeeming about this story as a
It's a
story.
very formulaic genre. It follows a formula to a T, and it works for reasons I could go into it psychologically of why it works with its audience, but that would be a whole show of its own. But
But I will say, when you're reading through it, and like, he began unbuttoning his shirt, button by button, until his bare chest glistened. And like, really, and I'm not doing it. Wait, I could really use the actual text in front of me, but like, try to read it like you're trying to read this for like masterpiece theater, like in that style, and the dissonance can be really funny.
I'll interrupt you for a second, because on that note, there's a video out there on YouTube that you should find. You will love. It is Charles Dance reading from Twilight. And it's the same thing. It's exactly what you say. He's going very serious on it. It's hilarious. It's extremely funny. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. My wife is correcting me in the background. It's not Twilight. It's 50 Shades of Grey that he's reading from.
Wow.
And so it is. It is exactly what you're talking about. The dissonance between the two is hysterical.
Yeah, so I actually got a romance novel to find more scenes like this, and I will say I really loved the line, "He cupped her gently rotating femininity." Somebody went crazy with the thesaurus on that one.
Yeah, they did.
Because my wife went and, well, at the time girlfriend, but she actually went and made like an animated GIF. With like an anatomical drawing, and then had the femininity rotating. Because there's zero ways this actually works out.
I was trying to figure it out in my head, I have to admit. I'm like, how does that work?
And it doesn't. I mean, I'm pretty sure somebody had a thesaurus, and they were looking for like vibrating, and then the next word that they found. Because I think especially in older times when we had paper thesauruses, and you'd be hunting for synonyms, and the first, all 5 synonyms were all words you'd already used anyhow. So then you have to look up those, and there's that thesaurus hunting, and I think that happened, and there's something like, I'm guessing like vibrating or something eventually, got to some intermediate where it had rotating, and somehow maybe a very tired author ended up putting that in. I don't know. But that being said, I will say, actually, having read through the thing as I was hunting for passages to read in this fashion, it was not actually that bad. Like, formulaic, yes, but like well crafted at the same time.
Right. And I not necessarily throwing out formulaic as a bad thing. If you look at anything that's truly and honestly original, very often you'll find people don't like it, or at least most people don't. And you can take the same concept, and then by the time it hits maybe its 3rd or 4th iteration, people start to like it. But your audience needs enough familiarity with what you're doing to actually kind of get it. Or sometimes they'll get it, but it'll just, because it's so original, it's uncomfortable. And you need enough familiarity with it to be comfortable with it before you go. Before you can really get into it. And I've had examples of this in the past, and I can't think of any at the moment, but there are some I've seen where, I've seen something done original and really interesting original concept, and it just doesn't hit with anybody. And then somebody will do the same thing a little bit later and make it a success. People need a bit of familiarity, and a lot of genres have formulaicness to them. Not just the romance genre. It is one of the most formulaic because of what it's actually trying to do. But
plus, sometimes they have actual literal written down formulas.
Yeah, very much. But urban fantasy has a bit of a genre that it goes through. The mystery novels are pretty formulaic as well. There's definitely a pattern that they follow. Um, 80s television, as we talked about earlier, was very formulaic.
Oh yeah. Well, also 80s, the classic 80s movie. Have you ever seen the short film 80s movie ending?
No, but I'm gonna have to go look that up now because that sounds
Yes,
awesome.
that's the title. 80s movie ending. It is if you especially for anyone who grew up on 80s movies, it is amazing. It is the people who did it were really skilled, and it is just it's astonishing how well it works. Um,
Well, it falls into it. And my wife's a little bit younger than I am, so she didn't grow up on the 80s movies, but she's watched a lot of them, often humoring me, but she's enjoyed a lot of them too. But, one of the things she laughs about is every time we watch an 80s, you always know it's an 80s movie, even if without the ending, when you get to the credits roll and there's the song that was, like the pop song that was made for the movie that like is right there with the credits rolling.
yeah.
Certain touches of formulaicness that are out there and they work. The Marvel superhero movies that have been huge lately, and I love them. They're amazing, and there's definitely a Marvel formula that they're following with each of the movies. There's a bit of variation going on in there, but there's a lot of formulaicness to them as well. Um,
Oh yeah, and
Jane,
they're winning formulas.
yeah,
Like
right,
oddly enough, something that inspired me to a degree on one story I wrote was my sons were watching Ninjago, and it was so ludicrous. I mean, it was formulaic to the point where they were making fun of how formulaic it was as they were doing it.
right.
Which is a thing in kids' entertainment these days. I think off getting to the point of being overdone. Where they're just losing all subtlety and just sort of being so blatant about it that I think it being overdone. But whatever that is, so incredibly formulaic that they're joking about it as they're executing the formula, and I still enjoyed it.
Sure. Another kids show that I've watched with my own children that does that a lot and did it extremely well is Phineas and Ferb. If you've ever watched the show at all, if you haven't, you should try it with your kids. It's one of the few kids shows you'll enjoy it as much as they do. But it does by about the third season or so. They've done the formula so much with the show that now they're just playing with it and trying to doing all kinds of in jokes based on assuming that you've seen the previous seasons of the show, so you're catching all the jokes about the formulas that they're making.
Mm.
Again, it's an extremely formulaic show, and even worse than most, it's a half-hour show, right, with
Mm.
two 15-minute segments in it. So you're repeating the formula twice in the half hour when you're watching it, and yet they still make it work every time. Formulaicness is not in and of itself. It's not the horrible thing we sometimes treat it as in the modern world.
Mm.
But it certainly can be. I mean, we've all seen bad examples of just staying too close to the formula and
Yeah.
getting it
Well,
too.
so much of it is execution, and an interesting
It
metaphor
is.
is essentially that the formula is the skeleton, and you have to put something on it. You need flat, you need organs, you need muscles, you need skin, and that's the execution of the story, where you have the skeleton that gives it its basic shape, and then you put a living thing on top of it. And I think the ones that we really tend to call formulaic are, using this metaphor, where there's nothing really on top of the skeleton. There's just sort of the skeleton there.
Right. Right, I think so. Well, and execution is really the root of the problem. My friend Dan is a game developer, and he likes people. He's a game developer, so people bug him all the time. Like, I have this idea for a game, right? And I mean, he's not a small name either. I mean, he was the lead graphics programmer on Civilization 5, so he's
Wow.
fairly big in the industry. And people are bugging him. It's like, look, it's like just stop telling me your game ideas. It's like I have more game ideas than I could ever possibly make already. And he points out, and very correctly, that the problem isn't ideas. The problem is execution all the time. Like you can have great ideas, but you've got to make a good product out of it at the end of the day. And making a good game, or even making a good book, or a good movie, or a good whatever, is much harder than just having a good idea. You know, you've got to actually execute that idea really well, and oftentimes a mediocre idea executed very well is better than a great idea executed poorly.
Mm.
So, you know, there's a reason for the formulas. That one of the things the formulas do is help you execute an idea well,
Mm.
you know, because you can
Oh,
follow
yeah.
the formulas somebody else has already set up.
Well, and an interesting thing, and this is getting a little bit into storycraft, but you know, because talking to people, you know, working through their, you know, plot problems and so on, and a lot of plot problems I've noticed come from having the formula and having your characters and not realizing that this formula doesn't work this way for these characters. That you know, whether it's one
Sure.
character just does not have the motivation to go do the thing that they need to do, and that's not inherently, you know, that's a problem in the sense of, like, you know, I need something to keep me off the floor, and all I've got are these nails and you know, these wooden planks and a hammer and some screwdrivers and a bit of wood glue is a problem.
Right.
So a lot of where you do come up with the original stuff is in the, here's this person who has this odd characteristic, and how do you make the formula actually work such that everyone in it is, you know, all the characters are actually doing things that are natural to them, such that they're not violating their character.
Right.
So what additional things do you have to introduce? You know, some new characters, some, you know, unusual motivation or something, such that it balances out. And that's where you get the originality on top of, you know, in executing a formula. And, you know, an example I like to use, I actually reviewed the movie, give a few second review recently. Have you ever seen the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movie Top Hat?
No, I haven't seen that one.
Um, I happen to. I mean, one of the hobbies I have, though I haven't done it recently, is swing dancing, and so I, you know, like dancing. I like musicals somewhat. I really love the Astaire Rogers films. I do like the dancing in them. But Top Hat is my favorite Astaire Rogers film because it was really, really well done as a movie, and it's fundamentally a mistaken identity premise. You know, the mistaken identity premise. You know, the central problem is that somebody thinks a person is somebody else, and that causes all the problems that have to get resolved by the end. And in mistaken identity premises, usually I found that there are, like, you know, 5 or 10 places where this really should have been resolved now, and there's absolutely no good reason why the person didn't use the other person's name here. Like, zero good reason why they did. They
Right.
should have. That's what everybody would have done, and you didn't, for no good reason. Top Hat is unlike that because the execution of it was
Right.
masterful. Every single time when it should have been resolved, there's some actually good reason why it wasn't. And I think that's a good, you know, sort of example of what making a formula work well and good execution is that it's, you don't bend the characters out of shape to fit the formula. You introduce things, you know, you introduce new things that balance out and redirect things and shape them such that you are executing the formula, but you're doing it in a way that is actually natural, so that all your characters are doing things they would actually do.
That, yeah, I haven't seen that film, so I couldn't comment. What I can say is I can actually give you the opposite. I can give you an example of where somebody did something to fit a formula, and their end result didn't work very well. Are you familiar with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy
I've read the
series at all?
first one. I
Okay.
haven't gotten to the others yet.
So the third book in the series, Life, the Universe, and Everything, the original version of that book was actually originally written by Douglas Adams as a Doctor Who script that was
Huh.
rejected from Doctor Who. And so he reworked the plot to fit into these characters, and it's largely regarded as one of the by far lesser entries in the series and not liked well at all. And even the author in interviews and stuff in the past has admitted, well, it's because I've warped these characters to fit into the Doctor Who character mold, and they really don't belong there at all. And but you know, he's also rather infamous for being a pretty heavily lazy writer who could never meet a deadline at all. So it was basically, I have a deadline, I have to meet it. Here's I'm going to recycle some material that got rejected by somebody else and go from there. And the result, honestly, is a book that really doesn't work very well at all. And it has moments that work, and it has some stuff, but it's gotten pretty far afield from where the series had been before at that point. So yeah, execution matters a lot, and sometimes, like you say, mapping your characters to a formula just really doesn't work well at all. I could see, I don't have a good example, but I could see a ton of other characters out there you could probably warp into a basic Doctor Who-ish formula pretty well, probably. A lot of mystery story characters could probably fit into that pretty well. But that particular set of characters just didn't fit with it. And he didn't do enough to really make them fit well. He tried, but,
Yeah, well, sometimes you have to. So, I mean, something I've seen, both working my own plots and talking with other people, is sometimes you have to be willing to make detours in order to get someplace.
Right.
That these characters will not go there, but they might be willing to go here and then come back over. Right. But you have to be willing to actually take them there, and it can feel weird as you're doing it. But that's also, I think, one of the great places for stimulating creativity, and where you get some real originality in telling the same story that 50,000 other people have told, is that if you really are willing to commit to this character has this personality, so let me come up with, and it may be introducing another character who wouldn't normally be here, but that balances them out, or it could be, changing backstory. There are any number of things. There isn't a generic solution, obviously, but
absolutely. And I'm a big believer in one of the things you said earlier when we were talking about 8-bit artwork, is that in some ways the limitation is what defines the medium, or defines the art. I hate, one of the absolute worst things for me is to sit down in front of a blank piece of paper, screen. I don't write by hand. Everything I do by digital. But to sit down in front of a blank screen and with everything wide open, I can write whatever I want. You know what comes out when I do that? Nothing. So, to me, having some kind of limitations is actually extremely helpful. With the two of the books we have published with Silver Empire are two anthologies of short stories, for instance. We had the theme of the anthologies before I wrote any of the stories that were in them, and having the theme gave me something to write. It's like, okay, there's a theme here. I need to write a story that fits that. I can work with that. The classic example that everybody pretty much is familiar with is the movie Jaws. Everybody knows the film, and most of the truly artistic ways in which they did all these creative shots came from the fact that the stupid mechanical shark just never worked. Right? So they had to shoot around the shark for the whole film because it wasn't working. And it's famous. It's a hugely famous story. Everybody knows this one. But the end result is a movie that's amazing and it's wonderful. And it would never have been that good if the shark had worked right, like it was supposed to work. And you see that in some of you see the opposite side of that. That's one thing I think is actually often a problem in modern cinema, is that the digital technology has given you the ability to do so much of everything that people never have to work around the limitations anymore. So they don't find that level of creativity. And I think the best example of that is actually the prequels, the Star Wars prequels.
I was going to mention that.
Somebody, the worst thing that ever happened was when you let George Lucas run wild with his amazing imagination. Like, put some limits on it, and you get amazingness out of it. Let him do whatever he wants, and you get, okay, George, maybe this isn't so great.
Yeah. Well, there's a related thing, I think, to the prequels, because I was going to mention the prequels, too, as my favorite example, because I went and watched a few of George Lucas's earlier things, like American Graffiti.
It's a great film.
It is. And something I kind of realized was, and I looked up a little bit of the history, and during the first 3 Star Wars movies, Lucas was very much constrained by other people having the money.
Yes, very much.
And so the thing is, he had to make a movie that appealed to other people's tastes.
Right.
And because there are 2 things to making good art. There's the creativity and there's the taste.
Yep.
The taste has to filter the creativity to get something good coming out. And I think what happened was, and this is one reason why the patronage model actually produced so much great art in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, because the rich, especially the rich people of the time, were just, this is a theme Chesterton had a lot. The interesting thing about a hereditary aristocracy is that people's children are nearly anybody. That you know, as much as we think of the idea of breeding or something, what actually happens in terms of personality is that you can very, very easily get an extrovert born to an introvert. You can get a geek born to a jock born to a geek. Whenever two people combine and make a new person, you have no idea what's coming out. You have a rough idea of what they're going to look like and how tall they're going to be, but no idea what their personality is going to be like. And so the thing about a hereditary aristocracy is, because you're following this line, and because people don't tend to be all that much like their parents in terms of personality in total, there'll be certain traits, mannerisms, of course. Hereditary aristocracies actually have a very oddly common element to them, because they get so many people who are just kind of ordinary in a variety of ways. Very distinct from meritocracy, because a meritocracy is selecting people after they're born.
Right.
And so you can select them for traits. And so a meritocracy can have everybody having roughly the same personality. And a hereditary aristocracy is actually much more like the majority. It's much more like humanity, because there's no filter. There's just whoever you happen to wind up with in that great lottery of sperm.
I'm going to tie that back even further to something you said earlier. When you have a meritocracy and everything is selected after the fact, you get into the statement you made before. When everything is judged by people, it becomes weird. And we've definitely seen that in the modern world. We have a meritocracy in a certain sense that has in many ways become very weird. Not that the aristocracy didn't have its own moments of weirdness, but
it did. But there's a historical detail that we tend to notice the weirdest aspects of them.
Right.
The people we remember are the ones who stand out, not the. Because the aristocracy actually was tend to be very local, and most of them didn't stand out all that much. Right. We also think of the very end of the hereditary aristocracy.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing about the patronage thing is that artists had to appeal to their patrons, and since their patrons tended to be fairly ordinary, artists had to appeal to relatively ordinary people.
Right.
And so there was a filter on a relatively normal person's taste being applied to a creative genius. And so the result was something that actually was good.
Yeah. And you see that in the modern world too. One of the things you see with a lot of authors, or one of the best examples, long-running series authors, when they finally do become big names and bestsellers, and sometimes you see them get to the point where you can clearly tell, like in the early books, an editor had a lot of influence in that and said, hey, we need to kind of work on this and some stuff. And then you get into the later books and they're like, cha-ching, we're just going to throw this out the door unedited because we know it's going to sell 10 million copies and we don't really care. And, the classic example, that everybody loves to go after, is Robert Jordan and the Wheel of Time series, which the first few books are phenomenal. And the last one that I actually read, I think there were about 2 chapters in the whole book where anything interesting at all happened. Clearly you get to a certain point and the editor's just like, I'm not going to tell this guy no, because if I tell him no, that you say, I won't print your book anymore because it's bad. What's he going to do? He's going to take that $1 million seller to somebody else. Are you going to be the editor who does that? No. So you hit the same problem where the person with taste is not in the equation anymore. There's not somebody around there to say, George, don't put that in the prequels. That's bad. And because again, are you going to be the guy who tells George Lucas no? No.
Yeah.
Because you have to feed your kids, and he's paying the bills. I absolutely agree with you on that. That you do need a filter of some sort, and you need people in every creative endeavor. You really need honest people around you to be able to look at it and say, hey, look, that's just bad. It's just, don't do that. And because we're all, honestly, we're horrible at judging our own works, right? Yes. You cannot look at your own work unbiasedly. You can try, and we all try, and you do the best you can. But at the end of the day, it's your own work, and there's only so much you can separate yourself from it.
Oh yeah, well, plus, I mean, there are a lot of other things, like, all the backstory you came up with that you didn't actually write down on paper, and who can actually remember everything that they wrote down versus what they
Right.
didn't.
Right. And that was, looking at, again, my, the novel draft that I just, sent off to my editor, and my wife have looked at it, and there's several bits in it where they're coming back with like, well, this bit of the story is kind of confusing. And it's like, oh, well, okay, I know what's going on in here, but I clearly didn't get that across well. So we're going to have to fix that before it goes out. And we will, that won't be a problem, but you need somebody else to tell you that, because you can't do that. It's like, well, I can't keep track of a simple example. I can't keep track of who's speaking and saying what in this section of dialogue. It's like, well, it seems clear to me, but well, it's because I know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, and it's funny, on the taste side of things, because it's something I'm aspiring to eventually being able to afford to pay an editor. Because I mean, absolutely, I've had to do my own editing, for practical reasons, and as my own patron, my budget is very limited at the moment.
Absolutely.
But something I've come across in my second novel, A Stitch in Space, I've heard it both criticized and praised for the same incorrect reason, which is I've heard it both praised and criticized as an apologetical work. And it's not. And I even put a preface in front of it explaining that this is not a work of apologetics. It's just the main character is a priest. And, well, people talk to priests, and priests talk about their faith. And I realized one thing that did, sort of creep in, and this comes to a matter of taste as an illustration thereof. I happen to find, these sorts of conversations where people are bringing up, some sort of problem, and the priest gives them an answer, like a theological problem or a philosophical problem. The priest gives them an answer. I happen to find that fascinating. And I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. It's not apologetical in that sense. This character is at this sort of crisis in their life. This is the thing that this particular character is wrestling with, having this character who's, moving to a different planet, which is a several-month voyage, because her life essentially was going nowhere and fell apart, long-term relationship. She's wrestling with certain problems. And I talked to a number of Catholic priests, actually, and they said, yes, lots of people come to them with their problems, and not just Catholics. It's actually fairly normal for everybody to come to Catholic priests. And, with problems, and they just like to talk to them. And so that happened here, because that's something that happens, and it's natural. And here's a person who's got problems, and here's someone who'll actually listen and talk, and they do, and brings up problems, and he gives answers. And I personally find that fascinating. Like, there's the things you do include and the things you don't include of what within your fictional world happens. And most of us, I think, leave out the scenes where they go to the bathroom, because that's kind of boring. And I just happen to find this as some of the most interesting conversations. And that is a somewhat unusual taste, I have discovered. And a lot of people see this, and since they don't find that as interesting as I do, they tend to assume that it's in there for an apologetical reason, whereas in reality, that seemed to be the most natural thing for these characters to be doing. And I actually tried to keep it short in a lot of places. And I tried to make sure there was a bunch of balancing things that were, either where the priest didn't have an answer to certain things, or just other conversations. And so I'm really going on long, and I apologize for that. But I think it's a really good example, because I happen to really like that book. I mean, in editing it, I read it like 7 times, and I still enjoyed it the 7th time I read it. But it does kind of highlight the problem of having unusual taste.
Well, you have that, and then at the other side of things, you're never going to make everybody happy. So, you're doing what is really the only thing you can do as an author, which is write the kinds of books that you would like to read, and hope that there's enough other people out there like you that will actually want to buy them. As an author and as a businessman, my personal feeling is that there probably are enough other people out there who are interested in them. You just have to find them, which is the tricky part. It goes back to discoverability, like we were talking about earlier. But the other thing that I find fascinating about those comments you're talking about is it illustrates to me something that I've found as an interesting thing in modern fiction. And I'm going to give you an aside here real quick. My headphones are telling me the battery's low, so I'm probably not going to have a lot more time left. And this is something I've actually thought about writing. I've written a few blog posts about it, but I'm definitely going to be writing more in the future. We live in a world that has decided that if you're writing anything at all about religion now, you must be apologizing for that religion. It must be an apologetic. And it's fascinating. I read something the other day that was talking about, well, why doesn't Christian fiction sell? Right? And, I scratched my head a little bit about that, because up until about the 1970s or 1980s, like, everything published in the Western world was kind of implicitly Christian. Not necessarily explicitly Christian, but kind of implicitly. Like, it's just kind of taken for granted as the worldview. And a lot of that stuff sold really, really well, and still sells really well. Dracula is a great example. It's kind of the prototypical vampire story. Everything we do vampire-wise is based on it. Everything about that story takes for granted that the Christian worldview is correct.
Oh,
okay?
Yeah.
It
very much so.
Oh, man, my headphones died. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
So, the story doesn't work at all if you take out the Christian worldview. But nobody would really call the story a Christian apologetic either, right? It's not. So, it's just something where we've had a fundamental change in how we approach fiction. And my own novel, Post-Traumatic Stress, I kind of took that approach. Like, it's not an explicitly apologetic or religious story, but it is the world is one where it assumes that the Christian worldview is correct, and the fantastical elements of the story are kind of built upon that. So I'm well aware that some people are going to take it as a Christian apologetic, even though it's not really meant to be that. And that's whatever. If somebody wants to take it that way, that's fine. But to me, it was really just okay, this is what, for the story I'm trying to tell here, this is what makes sense for the story to do. So, that was the direction I went with it. So I'm sympathetic to what you're saying there, because to me, it's just a case of there's a subset of our population now that just hears religion and assumes you're now pro that religion, and can't take it any other way. Can't even take it as I'm not even for this religion. I'm just exploring what are honestly the most interesting questions that mankind can ask.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's an interesting topic to in a very complicated topic, and it actually just because we do need to wrap up, but just one, I guess one very short comment on that is that I didn't really mind the people who criticized it as being apologetic. It was the people who praised it as being apologetic that really got me.
I can see that.
It's like, yeah. Oh, I was hoping you guys would get it. But
the other thing I'll say there, though, is that every work that's great goes beyond whatever the author originally intended to do in it. And one of the things I think that makes a work really great is that people can see it in different ways and read it in different ways and interpret it in different ways. And that's usually what makes something that really resonates and lasts. And I've seen a lot where I've read works or watched a show or a movie or a play or whatever, and the author will swear up and down that they didn't put that in there. And as a viewer or a reader or whatever, I'm sitting there thinking, you may not have put it there, but it's there. So I'm not
Yeah.
accusing you of that. In this case, I have not read that book. I've read some of your other works, but I haven't read that one. But you know, it's not always a bad thing when it's there. If somebody gets something out of your work that, you know, you didn't mean to put there, but it's a positive thing, I wouldn't necessarily take that as a bad criticism. You know, just
No, no, that's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, in this case, it felt like it was, you know, because actually, just a funny thing in the backstory of this is just that the way I got this, I mean, the way I got my premise was actually an atheist friend of mine who said, "You should write a story about a priest in space." And I said, "Okay." You know, I actually I joke, but I discovered that one of the rules I live my life by is when an atheist friend of mine tells me I should write a story about a priest in space, I do.
ah,
It's an oddly specific rule. You know, most of them are more general, but well,
I
that's one of the
probably
rules
would
I
have
live
done
my
the
life
same.
by.
I get that.
Yeah. So anyway, and so that was the story I was writing, and everything else followed from that. And so but I know what you mean, where people assume, and I mean, we live in an area. Chesterton actually remarked, you know, so this puts it 100 years ago, but the modern world's been going on for a while now. That we live in the area in the era of publicity, and you know, and I think as a sort of corollary to that, we live in the era of salesmanship, where most people are selling something, and
Absolutely.
you know, and of course, you know, that is, you know, proper, you know, in a business. I mean, it's very natural for a business to sell something. So, you know, if a bookseller is selling books, well, obviously, you know, you should be selling books. But it sort of permeates the culture where, you know, there's that idea of message fiction. And I've always loved that quote. I can't remember who it was by, but if you've got a message you want to get out, use Western Union. And you know that it fiction should have a subject. It should have, in some sense, a point. It shouldn't have a message, because a message is something you could just write down in a few words, and that's your message. You know, you should explore an idea in fiction. You shouldn't just have a message in it. And so I guess, you know, I'm also a little, you know, possibly just I'm worried that people thought it was message fiction rather than, you know, just exploring an idea. But anyhow, I don't want to, you know, harp on my own book a lot. Um, so wrapping this up, I do think, you know, something we mentioned a few times, and it strikes me, and you mentioned that that one of the great problems that we have, you know, now that distribution's easy, is discoverability.
Mhm.
And I guess this is something that we're all going to be working on quite a lot in the coming years. Is how do we solve the problem of discoverability?
Um, we all become salesmen, right? No. The flippant response just based on what you're saying a second ago. If I had the answer to that, Chris, I wouldn't be here talking to you because I'd be printing billions of dollars. But no offense either. I'd be too busy. But I don't. You know, not an enduring answer. And if you look at most of the people who have been discovered, what's interesting is you don't often really see the same stories twice.
Mm,
People get discovered in so many different ways, and they fight through it in different ways, and you know, you have to keep pushing and find your own way. My own personal belief is that one of the answers is persistence. You mentioned before having your day job letting you be your own patron, basically, and that's essentially my own solution as well. I actually have a pretty good day job. I'm very lucky in that sense, and so what it lets me do, what it means is that I don't have to be an overnight success at any of this stuff. And you know, the one common thing you do tend to hear from authors, particularly, one of the nice things about being an author is that production costs are very cheap as well, right? You go into film or television or video games these days and you need a multi-million-dollar budget. But as an author, really all you need is, you know, a pen and paper or a laptop. You can sit down and write and you can get it all out. And even putting together a final book, you know, is not that expensive. You know, even if
mm.
you want to pay an editor, you know, a couple $1,000s total, really max. And it's a budget most people can come up with if you've got a decent day job. So again, it's the discoverability that's the issue. But the one common thread that you see through authors, despite that, even traditionally published authors, is that very few of them are J.K. Rowling and have a first book that sells millions of copies. Most of the time, what you see is, oh, yeah, I was round about book 10 before I became a New York Times books, or maybe book 4 or 5 before I became a New York Times bookseller, and round about book 10 before I could quit my day job, and, on and on. And the answer is that persistence is what I think turns out to be the key for most of us mere mortals who aren't Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or whoever, that just, being able to hang out in the game long enough for people to discover your works, being able to just chip at it, day after day, month after month, year after year, until finally you've got enough work out there and enough people start to discover it that it kind of snowballs from there. And so for myself and for Silver Empire, that's kind of the basis of our plan is, hey, we don't have to be an overnight success. We can afford to play the long game here and just wait until we do hit enough discoverability for everything to go large. And that's what most people miss. You write a novel, it hits or it gets out there and then it never sells. And then a lot of people just, well, I'm not destined for that career. Well, that's just not how the business works these days. It just doesn't anymore. Self-published or traditionally published, it just doesn't work that way anymore. So if you want to make it big, you've got to be persistent and go after it and build up enough body of work that you can eventually make it.
Yeah, well, it was something I can remember as a teenager when I looked around at people who were successful, authors and other things, because I had ambitions to write from fairly young. And I remember it was in a sense, a very depressing thing that hit me. But I realized, you know what? Virtually everyone who is successful is much older than me. Outside of fictional characters on television, everyone who is successful is like several decades older than I am.
Yeah.
And it kind of occurred to me, there may be a sort of causative effect going on. That it may take a while in order to actually become successful.
There's a relationship there. I know for myself, I'm pushing 40 myself. I'm getting close to that. And I can tell you I'm far more successful as I close in on 40 than I was when I closed in on 30. And I've got a lot of other pots on the stove, waiting to see what happens with them. And I expect to be far more successful at 50 than I am now. And sometimes there's just no substitute for time and hard work. In any industry, you have to pay your dues, right? It doesn't matter what industry you're in. You got to start somewhere and you got to put in your time and pay your dues before you get successful and make it to the top. And in writing, it seems like the way you pay your dues is you spend a lot of time writing a lot of stuff that doesn't pay you very well until finally someday it does. But the beautiful thing about today's world with distribution is I've written that stuff and it's out there forever now.
Yeah.
It's not like the old days where I had a 10,000 print run and that was it. When they sold, it was done and there was nothing anymore. With digital distribution, that's out there forever. So I spent the time to put that work in and get that work done. And it may not pay much, but that will bring royalties for the rest of my life. Right?
Yeah.
It's like compound interest. That adds up over time.
Yes. And especially I think it gives a real possibility as somebody discovers your work, since you mentioned this before, people tend to like authors. And when you find an author you like to see what else have they written and
Exactly.
go through it. And when you have that back catalog, it now becomes possible each time somebody discovers you and likes your stuff for them to go through and find all the other things you've done.
Absolutely. And at an average ebook price of $3 or $4 a book, right? When you have one book out there, that new reader who discovers you is, $4 in revenue. Okay, not that much. When you have 20 books out there, that new author who discovers you is $80 in revenue, or something like that. That's a huge difference. It makes a world of difference. And each one of those is a new chance at being discovered.
Also
You
for
know,
recommendations too, that as somebody works through, as you read through back catalogs, because I think readers, we all like to recommend things to each other.
right.
Because we really enjoy, if you recommend something to somebody, it's just so great when you hear they actually enjoyed it. Um, and we just love to, pass around that happiness. And so every time, for every book in your catalog, if somebody goes through reading it, that's another chance that I have a friend who would actually really like this one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's another chance. There's a level at which any entertainment industry in the modern era is kind of a hit driven business. It's driven by the hits. And every work you get out there is another chance. It's like buying another lottery ticket, right?
Mm.
And every one you get out there. So the more you get out there, the more chances you have to win. And but the thing is, the more you have out there, the bigger your winnings finally are if you do win as well. So you have to write material that's good. If you write material that's bad, it doesn't matter how much of it you write. But at
Yeah.
the end of the day, what I've noticed from sitting and listening to quite a few now best-selling authors tell their stories is that what really ends up being the thing that's in common through almost all of them is I just didn't give up and I kept writing and I kept putting stuff out. And the modern world makes that easier than ever. So
Mm.
it's like the old joke of, if I put, would I rather get paid X many dollars or get paid $1 today, but you double it every day for 30 days? When the growth happens over time and eventually you're making a lot more that way. But writing is often starting out that way. The very beginning is next to nothing. But, if it doubles every year that you're getting, what you're getting, then eventually that adds up to something. But as you said, it takes time. You don't become successful at 20 with that business model,
No.
but you might become wildly successful at 50 with that business
Mm.
model. So
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned listening to the lives of stories of authors becoming successful, because for a while I was on a real kick reading biographies of anyone like Sam Walton, Steve Martin, really eclectic stuff, just biographies of people who are successful at something. And it was kind of funny, especially because it was, Sam Walton with Walmart and Steve Martin and stand-up comedy, and a lot of different things, very different stuff. But there was always, they all had that persistence. They kept trying. And in fact, the story of almost everyone that I read, the story of their life could loosely be summarized as a broken string of failures.
yep, absolutely. It's very common. And, that's something in our society that I actually worry quite about is that quite a bit about is that we've developed a society that doesn't let people fail anymore and teaches you that if you fail, you're a failure as a person. When in reality, a successful person is just somebody who didn't quit when they failed. We all fail all the time. All the successful people, like, Bill Gates is one people look at a lot because he was so young when he got rich, when he was successful with Microsoft. And he founded Microsoft at such a young age. And even at that young age, Microsoft was his third company. You know, and you could not possibly call the man a failure. But even at that, most of us, we all fail all the time, and we'll all be hitting things. And I've heard several people I read lately have even thrown out the advice of fail faster. Don't be afraid of failure. Fail faster so that you can move on to the next thing and get on with that. And you have to be willing to do that. You have to be comfortable with taking some risks. Like I mentioned a few times earlier in the program, Lyonesse is definitely a risk with us. It's something that it's a low risk because we've what it'll cost us if it fails is low, but it's very much a risk that it may just not work out. It may just be that the short fiction market's really and truly dead, and there's not much we can do with it.
Or
But you
not
have to be
here
ready
this
to try
year.
it. You'll never know if you don't try, and you got to give it a shot. So
Yeah, the only things that actually work are real things.
that's right. Exactly. You know, the wonderful, beautiful idea in my head is worth nothing. You know, it's only when you have something real that it's worth anything. So, you know.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's funny you mentioned, and you're wrapping up. It's actually something you mentioned being afraid of failure. I actually like to use the word failing whenever it is technically accurate. I like to use it just in casual conversation. You know, like I tried to, I tried to get that to the post office, but I failed. You know, just when it's actually accurate, like I was going, but I end up being too late or something. You know, the post office was closed. I will describe that as I attempted and I failed at it. Because
How awkward does that make people?
Sorry, what?
How awkward does that make people?
They get used to it over time. But what I found, it does have an interesting thing of desensitizing, because it is, and I've had some, I've done this with my, especially with my older son, talking about like, okay, you tried and you failed, try again. And and I've had a few cases where people are like, oh no, it wasn't a failure. Yes, it is. You attempted to draw this. It looks nothing like the thing you drew. The kid knows it looks nothing like the thing he was attempting to draw. He's got two eyes. They both work. It was a failure. Okay, now move on.
Well, and yeah, that's not a bad idea. I can see the merit in that. And you've got to keep moving on past it. You got to pick yourself up and go. And we have too much society these days where people are insulated. They're not allowed to fail in the first place. And if they do, they're told that, well, it's not a failure. It's okay. And, and then after that, if they do find out it's a failure, then they're allowed to just sit and cry, right? Well, okay, great, but you're never going to get anywhere that way. You've got to, okay, failure, it happens to all of us. It happens to all of us, and it'll happen a lot, right? It is life. Life is kind of harsh, and it will beat you down if you let it, and it will knock you down. And the only thing you can do is just get back up and, go after it. And
that's why video games are nice, because they have a very different, they have very different structures than real life, both with regard to failure, and failure is less common, well, unless you play on like the really hard settings. And the other thing is the rewards come much faster relative to the amount of work you put in. Those things there are some exceptions, especially for people who get really, really good. They tend to like to play on super hard settings where they almost always fail. But but for, especially for more casual people, most games, the amount of like one of my hobbies, you might be able to see it up here, is some of the longbows I've made. And I don't know if you can see well or not, but
yeah, I can.
They're unstrung. And actually, I decided a while ago, why should the people who lived 1,000 years ago have all the fun of figuring out how you can make a piece of wood shoot an arrow? Why do I have to be stuck with just reading how you do this and how it works? Why can't I just get some wood and attach string to it and see how it failed and see how I can fix that until I've got something that actually works? Like in the modern era, virtually nothing, there's almost all the low-hanging fruit's already been plucked. But if you just don't read the book of the guy who first plucked it, you can go pluck it yourself. You can have all the fun of actually discovering it without needing a $50 million budget to be able to get the high-powered lasers with the micrometer level precision. You can try the things where you can actually scrape it with a knife and make it work that way. And I decided, you know what? I'm actually not going to research this one. In my day job, I research things. Lots of other stuff, I research them. I'm not researching this one. I'm just trying it. And, I had one bow that somebody had made, and they, copied some elements of the design and figured out, like, okay, I see why this isn't bending right here. And a bunch of stuff like that. I'm working on ones that are carbon fiber backed. The back's the part that's away from you when you draw it, and the belly's towards you. And, so I'm doing something very, very strange. I mean, a carbon fiber backed, mostly wood bow is kind of an odd thing to do, in a sense, but they've got some nice characteristics. But the important thing is, actually, I've got right here. This one was utterly fascinating. And let me see if I can hold that closely enough that you can see. This thing actually failed. This is the first one I did. And I don't know if you can see up here. I might be able to. The light's not great. But the fibers on both sides on the top, which are under tension, literally pulled apart from each other. And you can see the
Okay.
ones that are sticking out and the ones, where they're holes.
Yeah, I can kind of see.
Yeah, the fibers had been like this and then pulled apart on the top. Once they were gone, because a bow acts like a lever, right? Because
Right.
it's pulling on this side, it acts like a lever relative to the thick part. Once that was gone, it got thinner. It was much less strong because resistance to bending goes up with the square of thickness, and you can see it then levered down. You can see the bottom part that was just bent over once the top had pulled out.
Right.
But actually, this side is the part that has a really good one. You can see that crack in there where a long piece of the wood just got yanked out. So I mean, this bow failed. I was bending it and then crack, crack, crunch, and it was fascinating. I mean, I learned so much from this thing failing.
Yep.
So I guess, in a sense, failure is a great note to end on.
Yeah.
To wrap all this up, one of the lessons is to not be afraid, or, to end on that conclusion of don't be afraid to fail. Because
not at all. Go out there and give it a shot.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Russell, for talking with me. It's been a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.
When I post the video, I'll include links to Lyonesse and so on in the description.
Appreciate it.
For watching. And all right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll keep in touch.
Yep. And for anyone watching, until next time, hit everything you aim at.